There are nights that don't just change your circumstances, they rewrite who you are entirely. On a highway swallowed by darkness and rain, a broke single father with $14 to his name and an eviction notice taped to his door made a choice that most people wouldn't. He pulled over. He got out of his warm truck in the middle of a violent storm. He helped a stranger. It was the kind of ordinary decency that goes unnoticed 1,000 times a day. Except this time, that stranger had powerful enemies. And now so did he. If this story pulls you in from the very first minute, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Let's go. The rain started around 9 that Tuesday evening, and by 10 it had turned into something that didn't have a polite name anymore. It came sideways. It came in sheets so thick that the yellow center lines on Highway 9 disappeared entirely, swallowed by water and darkness, and the few drivers still out on that stretch of road had their hazards blinking like desperate little heartbeats against the black. Most of them kept moving. Most of them put their foot down and got where they were going as fast as the weather would allow. Nobody stopped. Nobody even slowed down all the way. Mason Carter slowed down. He didn't know why exactly. He'd tell you later that it was automatic, that 32 years of living close to the bone had wired a certain kind of instinct into him, the kind that makes you look twice when something feels wrong. What he saw from the cab of his 2009 Ford F-150 was just a shape at first. A dark mass half pulled onto the gravel shoulder. One wheel dropped into the drainage ditch at a bad angle, hazard lights throwing orange pulses into the rain. Could have been anything. A deer strike, a blowout, somebody who'd already called for help and was fine. He drove past it. Then he stopped. He sat there for about 4 seconds, with the wipers going full speed and rain hammering the roof of his truck like something with a personal grudge. Then he put the truck in reverse and backed up slowly along the shoulder until his headlights swept over the car. It was a Mercedes. Black. One of the big ones, an S-Class, maybe a couple years old, and it was sitting wrong, nose angled toward the ditch. The front passenger tire shredded completely off the rim. Not flat, shredded. There was a difference, and Mason noticed it immediately, the way a mechanic notices anything mechanical that doesn't add up. A blowout leaves a specific kind of damage. This looked like something else. He killed the engine but left the headlights on and grabbed the maglite from the glove box. His rain jacket was balled up behind the seat, still damp from a job he'd done 3 days ago in a client's driveway during a light drizzle. He pulled it on, zipped it, and got out. The rain hit him like a wall. He bent his head and walked toward the Mercedes, maglite cutting a pale beam through the downpour. He could see someone in the driver's seat through the fogged glass, sitting very still, not moving. He knocked on the window. Nothing for a second. Then the window cracked open about 2 inches, and a pair of dark eyes looked up at him through the gap. Not frightened exactly, but calculating. Like whoever was inside was running a fast risk assessment on whether Mason Carter was more dangerous than a flooded highway at 10:30 at night. "You okay in there?" he called over the rain. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady. "I already called for assistance." "All right." He took a step back, raised one hand in a whatever-you-need gesture, and looked down at the front tire again. The shredding pattern bothered him. It nagged at something in the back of his brain the way an engine knock nags at you. A sound that doesn't belong, that means something you haven't figured out yet. "You mind if I take a look at your tire?" A pause. "Why?" "Because something about it doesn't look right to me," Mason said simply. "I'm a mechanic. It won't take a minute." Another pause. Longer. Then the window cracked further, rain coming in now, and she said, "Go ahead." He crouched down beside the front wheel with the maglite aimed at what was left of the tire. The rubber was gone in strips, some of it hanging, some of it scattered back along the highway, visible in the beam of light when he swung it back the way the car had come. That was consistent with a blowout. But the rim itself had a different story. There were 2 neat score marks on the inner sidewall that hadn't been made by the road. They were clean, deliberate, made by something with an edge, not by asphalt. Mason stared at those score marks for a long moment. Water ran down the back of his neck and into his collar. He didn't move. Someone had cut this tire. Not all the way through. You'd notice that immediately. They'd cut it just enough that it would hold air for a while, maybe an hour of highway driving, maybe two, until the pressure and friction finished the job at whatever speed and location chance decided. He stood up slowly and turned back toward the car. The woman had opened the door. Not all the way, just enough to look out at him from under the edge of the doorframe, using it like a partial shield against the rain. She was around 30, brown hair soaked flat against her face, wearing clothes that cost more than Mason's truck payment. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between controlled and barely controlled. "Your tire didn't blow out," Mason said. She went very still. "What?" "It was cut. The sidewall, on the inside. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, made sure it wouldn't give out all at once." He kept his voice level. "You got enemies who drive nicer cars than they should?" For a second she didn't answer. The rain roared between them. Lightning flexed somewhere to the west, lighting up the horizon in a long white pulse, and in that half second of brightness, Mason saw her face fully, and saw that she already knew. She already knew someone had done this. She just hadn't been sure until right now. "Get in the car," she said quietly. "Please?" Mason looked back up the highway. The road was empty in both directions, just rain and darkness and the faint glow of his truck's headlights behind him. "Your assistant's call, how long did they say?" "I didn't actually call anyone," she admitted. He thought about that for exactly 1 second and then walked around to the passenger side and got in. The inside of the Mercedes smelled like expensive leather and something floral, faint, almost gone. The dashboard glowed softly. On the back seat, visible in the ambient light, there was a laptop bag, a small hard case with combination locks on the latches, and a thick accordion folder stuffed with papers, rubber banded at the center. She'd reached back and pulled a blazer over all of it the moment he sat down, which he noticed and didn't comment on. "Scarlett Whitmore," she said, and offered her hand. He shook it. "Mason Carter." "You're really a mechanic." "I really am. And you just stopped." She said it like it was a concept she was working through. "You didn't have to stop." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." She looked at him steadily for a moment. There was something focused about her face. The kind of focus that comes from a person who's spent years making fast decisions about who to trust and who not to. "The people who did this to my car," she said carefully, "they're not going to be happy that I didn't end up in that ditch." "I figured." "Which means if they were watching, they might have seen my truck." He said it before she could. "Yeah, I figured that too." A beat of silence. Rain on the roof, relentless. "And you're still sitting here," she said. "I'm still sitting here." Scarlett looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked away, out through the rain-blurred windshield, and Mason could see her jaw tighten slightly. The look of someone doing math they don't like the answer to. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more careful. "I'm the CEO of Whitmore Capital Group," she said. "Maybe you've heard of it." He had vaguely. Financial services, investment management. He'd seen the name on buildings downtown and on the business news that played on the TV in the shop waiting room when he couldn't find the remote. "Roughly," he said. "There are 3 members of my executive board who are in the process of stealing approximately $400 million from the company," she said, as flatly as if she were reading a grocery list. "I've spent the last 6 months gathering evidence. Tonight I was driving to meet the federal investigators handling the case." She paused. "The men who sabotaged my car know I have that evidence with me. If I don't make it to that meeting, the evidence disappears," Mason said, "along with me." She didn't dress it up. He appreciated that. Mason sat with that for a moment. Outside, another car finally passed, the first one in several minutes, headlights sweeping through the rain without slowing, gone in seconds. Someone with sense, heading home. "Is your phone being tracked?" he asked. She blinked. "What?" "If they knew you'd be on this road tonight, they knew your route. If they knew your route, they might be monitoring your phone." He nodded at the cell in her hand. "You should turn it off. Not airplane mode. All the way off." She stared at him. "You know about that?" "I know a guy who knows about that," he said, which was more honest. His buddy Dex, who'd done 3 tours overseas and come back with a mechanical engineering degree and a deep distrust of anything with a SIM card. Turn it off. She turned it off. Okay, Mason said. He pulled out his own phone, a cracked screen Android with a prepaid plan, and pulled up the map. My truck's got a full tank. I can get you wherever you need to go. But we should move now, not in an hour when your roadside assistant shows up and whoever's watching sees you standing next to a car that never made it to the ditch. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. Then, and it was the kind of thing you either trust or you don't, and she made the call fast the way she made every call. She picked up the accordion folder from the back seat, held it against her chest, and said, "The Federal Field Office. It's 40 minutes from here." "Then let's go." Getting out of the Mercedes and into his truck was 45 seconds of cold rain and sliding mud at the edge of the ditch. Mason kept one hand on her arm when she nearly went over on the uneven gravel, and she grabbed his jacket without asking. They got into his truck wet and breathing hard, and Mason had them back on the highway in under a minute. He drove without talking for a while. The rain was still terrible, but the visibility had crept up slightly, enough to see a quarter-mile ahead on the straight sections. He kept his speed just below the limit, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would eat up the tires on the standing water. Scarlett sat with the accordion folder in her lap and her laptop bag wedged between her feet. She'd retied her hair back with something from her pocket, and she was watching the road ahead with the same focused expression she'd had in the car. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shaking, she was thinking. "Who else knows you were coming tonight?" Mason asked. "My assistant. She arranged the meeting. You trust her?" "Completely." "Anyone else?" A pause that was slightly too long. "I thought I knew who was in my corner," she said finally. "I've been rethinking that for the last 4 hours." He nodded and didn't push it. They passed the county line marker and the rain thinned slightly, not gone but manageable, and Mason clicked his wipers down 1 speed. In the distance, the first cluster of city lights appeared along the horizon, orange smudges behind the clouds. "Why didn't you take the money?" Scarlett asked abruptly. He glanced at her. "What money?" "I offered you," she started, then stopped. "I tried to hand you the cash from my wallet back there, when you were crouching by the tire. You didn't even look at it." He had seen it, 5 bills fanned in her hand, held out through the cracked window. He'd been looking at her tire and hadn't reached for it. "I wasn't there for money," he said. "People are always there for money." "Not always." She looked at him the way she'd looked at the tire mark analysis, like she was trying to decide if the evidence matched the conclusion. "You said you're a mechanic. You work at a shop. Own it." "Well, I'm working on owning it. It's complicated." He shifted his grip on the wheel. The honest version was that his name was on a lease and a bank loan that was currently 3 payments behind, and that complicated was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, but he wasn't going to explain all that to a stranger in his truck on a Tuesday night in a rainstorm. "Do you have family?" she asked, and her voice had shifted slightly. Less CEO, a little more human. He was quiet for a second. "A daughter. She's 6. "Is she home alone?" "No, Mrs. Patel next door watches her when I work late." He paused. "She's good. Emma's good." Scarlett nodded slowly. She seemed to understand instinctively that this was a short answer to a longer story, and that he wasn't going to tell it tonight. They drove another 10 minutes. The city lights grew closer. Mason watched the mirrors more than the road ahead, which was a habit he didn't usually have. Nothing back there but empty highway and rain. "The score marks on the sidewall," Scarlett said, breaking a long silence. "You said whoever did it knew what they were doing." "Yeah." "Could you estimate the tool? The type of blade?" He thought about it. "Something narrow. Good steel. The angle of the cut was steep, not a box cutter or a kitchen knife. More like a precision tool. Machine shop maybe, or automotive." He glanced over. "Why?" "Because I want to be right about who this was," she said, "and I want them to not be able to deny it." Mason nodded. He didn't ask anything else. The Federal Field Office was in a converted office building 2 blocks off the downtown grid, unmarked except for a small agency seal beside the main entrance. Mason pulled up to the curb and put the truck in park. The rain had dropped to a drizzle now, just enough to blur the streetlights. Scarlett had her hand on the door handle, but she stopped, turned back toward him. "I want to pay you," she said. "Properly, not just—" She waved a hand dismissively at her wallet, a fistful of cash at the side of a road. "Something real. Let me—" "I'm okay," Mason said. "You could have kept driving." "I know. Most people would have." "I know that too." She studied him. Up close, in the yellowish light of the street lamp coming through the windshield, she looked tired. Not the kind of tired that a full night's sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from months of running at a pace that costs you something you don't get back. "Can I at least have your number?" she asked. "In case, I don't know, in case I need to find you." He told her his number, and she entered it into her phone before she remembered it was off. She turned it back on just long enough to save the contact, then powered it down again immediately. "Stay safe, all right?" Mason said. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. "You too, Mason Carter," she said. "I mean that." She got out. She walked across the wet sidewalk with the accordion folder clutched against her chest and the laptop bag over one shoulder, and she pushed through the glass door without looking back. Mason sat there for a second, watched the door close. Then he put the truck in drive and pulled back out into the street. He drove home through the tail end of the storm, thinking about those score marks in the sidewall, thinking about the angle of the cut, the clean edge, the kind of precision that didn't happen by accident and didn't happen by amateurs. Thinking about the fact that whoever made those cuts had known what car to find, what road to find it on, and had gotten close enough to do the work without being seen. By the time he pulled into his apartment complex parking lot and killed the headlights, the rain had stopped completely. The sky was still overcast, but the violence had gone out of it. He sat in the quiet truck for a minute, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. His phone buzzed. "Mrs. Patel. Emma fell asleep at 8. All good, doors unlocked." He sent back a thanks and got out of the truck. His apartment was on the second floor, Unit 214. The door, when he reached it, had a yellow envelope taped to it at eye level, the kind of envelope that real estate management companies use for notices. He knew what it was before he peeled it off. He'd been expecting it for 2 weeks. Final notice. 60 days had become 30, had become a number he didn't want to read in the harsh light of the hallway. He took the envelope inside and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. There wasn't any point in opening it. He already knew the number. He'd been rearranging the same math for 3 weeks, and it kept coming up short. $14 and change in his checking account. A shop with equipment loans and a landlord who'd stopped returning calls. A 6-year-old daughter asleep in the next room with shoes that were half a size too small and a backpack that had a broken zipper held together with a safety pin. He stood in the kitchen in his damp clothes and looked at the envelope and thought about the woman he'd just dropped off at a federal building with $400 million worth of evidence against people who'd already tried to kill her once tonight. He thought about the score marks in the sidewall. He thought about Emma's shoes. He put on the kettle and changed his shirt and went to check on his daughter. She was asleep in her bed with one arm around a stuffed elephant named Gerald that was missing an eye and had been restitched at the seam twice. The nightlight in the corner threw a soft orange glow across the room. Her hair fanned out around her on the pillow in the way it always did, and she was snoring. The tiny, ridiculous, perfect snoring of a 6-year-old who had no idea that her father had just spent 40 minutes driving a billionaire through a thunderstorm with a sabotaged Mercedes sitting dark and crooked on a highway shoulder 20 miles back. Mason stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time. Then he went back to the kitchen, made his tea, and sat down at the table with a legal pad and a pencil and started writing down everything he remembered about those score marks. The angle, the depth, the tool pattern, the type of steel edge that would make a cut that clean at that angle on a tire sidewall in the dark. He didn't know why he was writing it down. He just knew that something about tonight wasn't finished, and that the mechanic part of his brain, the part that couldn't let an unexplained noise go, couldn't walk away from an engine that didn't sound right, wasn't going to let him sleep until it had at least tried to make sense of the evidence. He wrote for an hour. Then he folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, and went to bed. Outside, on the street below, a dark car sat idling 3 spaces down from his truck. It had been there since he came home. Its lights were off. It didn't move. Mason didn't see it. He was already asleep. But it saw him. He slept 4 hours. Maybe 4.5. It wasn't the kind of sleep that restores anything. It was the shallow, restless kind where you're never quite all the way under, where sounds from the street filter through and get woven into whatever your brain is doing, and you surface every hour or so with your heart going slightly faster than it should. Mason woke up at 6:14 with his jaw clenched and the legal pad still sitting on the kitchen table where he'd left it, the penciled notes catching the early gray light coming through the window above the sink. He lay in bed for a minute, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet except for Emma's muffled movement in the next room, the specific sound of a 6-year-old who was awake but hadn't decided to announce it yet, the rustling and soft talking to stuffed animals phase that usually bought him another 15 minutes. He'd learned to recognize that window and use it. He got up, started coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The street below was ordinary morning. A woman walking a dog, a city bus hissing to a stop at the corner, someone's car not starting on the first try. His truck was where he'd parked it. The space 3 down was empty. Whatever had been sitting there last night was gone, and in the pale early light, Mason couldn't even be sure he hadn't imagined it. He'd been tired. He'd been running on tension and rain-soaked adrenaline. Empty cars sat on streets all the time. He poured his coffee and picked up the legal pad. In the daylight, his notes from last night looked both more and less significant than they'd felt when he was writing them. A list of mechanical observations about a tire cut he'd seen for 90 seconds with a flashlight in a downpour. Angle estimates, tool hypotheses, the kind of thing that was useful if you were in a shop with the evidence in front of you, and completely speculative if you were standing in your kitchen in yesterday's socks. He folded the pad and put it in the junk drawer under the takeout menus and the spare batteries. "Daddy?" Emma appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the small foxes on them that she'd picked out herself 6 months ago and still wore 3 times a week, even though the ankles were getting short. Gerald, the one-eyed elephant, was under her arm. "Is it a school day?" "Wednesday," he said. "So yeah." She processed this with the specific solemn gravity that Emma applied to most factual information. "Okay," she said, and went to the refrigerator and opened it and stood there staring into it the way she always did, like the contents might have changed overnight into something more interesting. "Eggs or cereal?" Mason said. "Can I have both?" "You can have one." "Cereal," she said, still looking into the refrigerator. "That's not in the refrigerator, bud." "I know. I'm looking for the orange juice." They ate breakfast together at the small table with the uneven leg that Mason had shimmied with a folded piece of cardboard 3 months ago and never properly fixed. Emma told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Priya about whether elephants were afraid of mice, which apparently was a major ongoing dispute. Mason listened and drank his coffee and watched his daughter's face while she talked. The way she used her hands, the way she pushed her cereal around while she was making a point, and tried not to think about the envelope on the counter. He thought about it anyway. After he dropped Emma at school, her backpack bouncing on her back, the broken zipper pinned shut, her voice trailing back to him with a "bye, Daddy" that she'd already half forgotten by the time the school door closed behind her. He sat in his truck in the drop-off lane with the engine running and did the math one more time. Rent past due. Shop equipment loan, 2 payments behind. The electric bill he'd been running on a payment plan since February. Emma's shoes. The backpack zipper, which was a small thing, but small things had a way of adding up into the shape of a larger failure when you looked at them all at once. $14.11. He had 3 cars booked for the week at the shop, an oil change, a brake job, and a transmission diagnostic that might or might not turn into actual work depending on what he found. If all 3 came through clean, he'd clear maybe $600 after parts. $600 wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was enough to buy a week, and sometimes a week was all you needed. He pulled out of the drop-off lane and headed toward the shop. The shop was a 2-bay garage on Clement Street that he leased from an older man named Bourdain who lived in Florida and managed the property through an agent who was difficult to reach and slow to respond to anything. Mason had been there 4 years. He'd built the client base himself, word of mouth mostly, some Yelp reviews that he'd never actually asked anyone to leave. It wasn't much to look at. The paint on the exterior was peeling, the sign above the door had lost the C in Carter Auto, and now just said Arter Auto, which his friend Dex thought was funnier than it was. But the equipment inside was solid, and Mason knew what he was doing. and people who knew cars eventually figured that out. He got there at 7:40, unlocked the bay doors, and had the first car, a 2017 Civic belonging to a teacher named Patricia, up on the lift by 8. He was under it checking brake wear when he heard a vehicle pull into the lot. He assumed it was his 830, a guy named Harold, with a Subaru that burned through rear tires faster than it should. He rolled out from under the Civic on his creeper and looked toward the lot. It was not Harold's Subaru. It was two vehicles. A black Tahoe with tinted windows and a smaller black sedan behind it, both of them moving at the careful, deliberate speed of vehicles that are going exactly where they mean to go. They pulled into his lot side by side and stopped, and for a moment nobody got out. Mason stood up slowly, wiping his hands on the shop rag tucked into his belt. The Tahoe's passenger door opened first. A man in his late 40s got out. Not large, not particularly imposing, but with the kind of posture that said he'd spent time in places where posture mattered. Dark jacket, no tie, earpiece visible. He scanned the garage with practiced efficiency and then looked at Mason. "Mason Carter?" "That's me." "We're with Ms. Whitmore's security team." He held up an ID that Mason couldn't read from 10 feet away. "She sent us." The sedan's back door opened then, and Scarlett Whitmore got out. She looked different in daylight. Or maybe it was just that last night she'd been a shape in a dark car in a rainstorm, and now she was a person standing in his parking lot in the morning sun, fully visible. She was wearing the same clothes as the night before, which meant she probably hadn't slept. Her hair was pulled back, and her jacket was buttoned, and she was carrying a coffee cup from somewhere, and she looked at Mason across the lot with an expression that was part apology and part something more urgent. "I'm sorry to come here," she said. "I tried to think of another way." "It's fine," he gestured at the garage. "Come inside." He turned the Civic's lift down and moved a tool cart out of the center of the bay to give them some room to stand. Scarlett came in, and the man with the earpiece, she introduced him as Rollins, no first name offered, stayed in the doorway with a sight line to the lot. The other vehicles stayed outside. "The meeting last night went," she started, then stopped. "It went as well as it could. The federal team has the evidence I brought them. That part is done." "Okay," Mason said. He could hear a but coming. "But one of the three executives I named, a man called Gerald Holt, has been running a parallel operation that even I didn't fully know about. He has people who are not corporate security and not law enforcement, and as of this morning, they know I survived last night." She paused. "And they know about you." Mason set the shop rag down on the tool cart. "How?" "We don't know yet. Could be surveillance on the highway, could be a camera somewhere near where your truck was parked, could be—" She stopped again, and he could see her choosing her words carefully. "Could be someone inside my own team. Someone on your security team told them about me." "Possibly. I'm working on finding out." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not here to drag you into something you didn't choose. I want you to understand that. But the reality is that these people now have your license plate, which means they have your name, your address, and—" "My daughter," Mason said. The words sat in the air between them. Scarlett didn't look away. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The Civic sat on the lowered lift behind him. From outside, somewhere down Clement Street, a bus went by. Normal morning sounds from a normal morning that was no longer, in any meaningful way, normal. "What are you suggesting?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "My estate is 40 minutes outside the city. It's secure, properly secure, not just cameras on the door. I have a full team there." She set her coffee cup on the corner of his tool cart, both hands free now, and faced him straight. "Bring your daughter. Come with me. Just until this is resolved, and I have reason to believe it will be resolved quickly now that the federal case is moving." "How quickly is quickly? Days? Maybe a week?" Mason looked at her. Then he looked at Rollins in the doorway. Then he looked out past Rollins at the two vehicles in his lot, at the street beyond, at the perfectly ordinary Wednesday morning going on outside his garage. "And if I say no?" he asked. Scarlett was honest about it. "Then I leave, and you go about your day, and maybe nothing happens. Maybe they decide you don't know enough to be a real problem." She paused. "But they already came to your neighborhood. There was a car parked outside your building last night. He looked at her sharply. You know about that. Rollins drove by at 2 in the morning to check. It was there. She held his gaze. I should have come sooner. I'm sorry. I was dealing with the federal team and I made the wrong call about timing. Mason breathed out slowly. He turned away from her and walked 2 steps toward the back of the bay and stood there with his hands on his hips, looking at the far wall, at the tool pegboard, the oil stain on the floor he'd never fully gotten out, the spare tire hanging on a hook, the small shelf with Emma's drawing taped to the corner of it, a crayon picture of a yellow truck labeled Daddy's Truck in uncertain 6-year-old letters, Emma's school, Emma's teacher, Emma's classroom with the cubbies and the reading rug and the thing she called the thinking chair that she'd explained to him once with great authority. He turned back around. I need an hour, he said. I've got a client coming at 8:30. I need to call him and the others on my schedule for the week. And I need to go get my daughter from school myself. I don't want her picked up by anyone she doesn't know. Of course, Scarlett said immediately. And I'm driving my own truck. That might not be. I'm driving my own truck, he said again quietly, and the tone of it wasn't negotiable. Rollins looked at Scarlett. She nodded once. All right, she said. We'll follow you. The phone calls were awkward and brief. Harold with the Subaru was annoyed. Patricia, the teacher whose Civic was on his lift, was understanding in the way that people are when they can tell from the sound of your voice that something is genuinely wrong. He locked the shop, rolled the bay doors down, and stood for a moment in the parking lot with the key in his hand, looking at the Arter Auto sign. He didn't know if he was coming back to this tomorrow or next week and he pushed the thought away before it finished forming. He drove to Emma's school with the Tahoe and the sedan in his mirrors the whole way. The school office was staffed by a woman named Doris, who had worked there for what appeared to be several decades and had seen, accordingly, most things. Mason explained that there was a family situation and he needed to pull Emma out for a few days, and Doris typed something into her computer and printed a form and slid it across the counter without any drama, and Mason signed it and thanked her. Emma was in the middle of a math lesson when he appeared in the classroom doorway, and she looked up from her worksheet with the particular expression of a child who is trying to decide if being pulled out of school is exciting or alarming. When her father smiled at her, she decided it was exciting. She gathered Gerald from her cubby, retrieved her jacket, said a loud goodbye to Priya and 2 other children, and took Mason's hand in the hallway. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere for a few days, he said, like a little trip. Do I need my swimming stuff? Maybe bring it. I don't know for sure. She accepted this with the adaptability of a child who had learned not to require complete information. Okay, she said. Can we go home first so I can get Gerald's hat? He left it on my bed. Gerald had a hat. It was a small knitted thing, red, that Emma had made with Mrs. Patel's help during a rainy weekend 2 months ago. It was critical. Yeah, Mason said. We can do that. At the apartment, Rollins came up with them. Not pushy about it, just present, which Mason found he didn't entirely mind given that the alternative was standing alone in a hallway, knowing there might be people watching the building. Emma looked at Rollins with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old and asked why he had a thing in his ear. So I can hear better, Rollins said, and his voice was unexpectedly gentle. Emma considered this. Like a hearing aid? Sort of like that. My friend Mateo has one of those, she said seriously. His is blue. Then she went to find Gerald's hat and left Rollins standing in the hallway with a look on his face that Mason couldn't quite interpret. Mason packed in 12 minutes flat. He'd gotten good at packing fast when Emma was smaller, and they'd done a lot of couch-to-couch moving around family and friends in the year after Lauren died. A period he didn't talk about much because he didn't need to, because anyone who'd been through it knew what that year was like, and anyone who hadn't couldn't really be told. He took enough for a week. He took Emma's swimming stuff because she'd asked. He took the legal pad from the junk drawer, which he wasn't sure why he did, but he did. He stood in the kitchen for a second and looked at the eviction notice still sitting on the counter, unopened. He left it there. They went downstairs. Emma held Gerald with one arm and her small rolling suitcase with the other, and she looked at the 2 big black cars in the parking lot with wide eyes. Are those ours? She asked. For today, Mason said. Cool, she said. Scarlett was out of the sedan and waiting. She crouched down slightly when Emma approached. not in an exaggerated way, just enough to be less towering, and said, "Hi, I'm Scarlett." Emma looked at her carefully. "I'm Emma. This is Gerald. He's an elephant." "I can see that. I like his hat." Emma looked at Gerald's hat and then back at Scarlett with increased approval. "I made it," she said. "That's really impressive," Scarlett said, and she meant it enough that Emma could tell she meant it, which mattered. They were on the highway heading out of the city by 10:15. Mason drove with Emma in the back seat, where she had her coloring book out within 4 minutes and was narrating a story about Gerald and a dragon to herself under her breath. Scarlett rode in the Tahoe ahead of him. Rollins rode with Mason. Front passenger seat, watching the mirrors more than Mason was. "You do this often?" Mason asked him. "Relocate people?" "More than I'd like," Rollins said. "You think she'll be okay? Whitmore?" Rollins looked at him. It wasn't a hostile look, more the look of a man measuring what kind of answer to give. "She's tougher than most people who've been in similar situations," he said finally. "That's the honest version." "What's the other version?" "That this isn't over yet, and I don't like to make predictions." Mason nodded. That was fair. The estate was not what he'd expected, which was foolish because he hadn't really formed an expectation. It was large, obviously. A long private driveway off a state road, tree line on both sides, a gate that opened on approach. But the house itself, when it came into view, wasn't the kind of architectural showcase he might have pictured. It was big, yes, but it looked lived in. There were actual flowers in the garden beds, which needed weeding. There was a basketball hoop in the side driveway with a ball left under it. Someone had left a coffee mug on the front porch railing and hadn't brought it in. "It's big," Emma said from the back seat, looking up at it through the window. "Yeah," Mason said. "Are we going to live here? For a few days? Where do we sleep?" "They'll show us." "Okay," she said, and went back to her coloring book. Inside, Scarlett moved through her own house with the efficiency of someone who'd been working there for years and was treating it like a temporary headquarters rather than a home. There were 2 men Mason hadn't seen before in the main room, both of them set up at a table with laptops and a large monitor displaying camera feeds from the property perimeter. A woman named Chen, 30s, sharp-eyed, whom Scarlett introduced as her lead investigator, was on a call in the corner and didn't look up when they came in. They showed Mason and Emma to rooms on the second floor, connected, with a shared bathroom and windows facing the garden. Emma immediately claimed the window seat in her room and put Gerald on it with great ceremony, arranging him so he could look out. "He likes to see where he is," she explained to the woman who'd shown them up, a quiet young member of the household staff who nodded with complete seriousness. Mason set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed in his room and put his face in his hands for a moment. Not dramatic, not falling apart, just a second. 1 second where he let himself feel the full weight of the last 14 hours without doing anything about it. His shop was closed. He'd called Harold and Patricia and one other client and canceled the week. That was money he wasn't making. The eviction notice was still on his counter. Emma's shoes were still too small. And he was sitting in a Billionaire's guest room because someone had cut a tire and put both their names on a list. He breathed out, stood up, went to check on Emma. She was fine. She was in the window seat with her coloring book telling Gerald about the garden below, which had a stone fountain that she'd spotted and was deeply interested in. "Can I go see the fountain?" "Not by yourself," he said. "I'll take you later." "Okay, Daddy?" "Yeah." "Why did we come here?" He thought about it. A friend needed some help, he said, which was both true and incomplete, the way most honest answers to 6-year-olds' questions were. "And we're helping." Emma thought about this with great seriousness. "Like how you helped Mr. Dominguez with his car?" "Kind of like that. Bigger problem, though." "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied, and went back to explaining the fountain to Gerald. Downstairs, things were less settled. He found Scarlett in a side room that had been converted into something halfway between a war room and a very messy home office. Papers on every surface, 2 laptops open, Chen off the phone now, and talking to one of the men from the front room in low, rapid sentences. Scarlett was standing at a whiteboard that someone had rolled in, reading a list of names written in black marker. She had one hand on her elbow and the other holding a dry erase marker she wasn't using, just holding, turning it in her fingers. She turned when Mason came in. Her face was tight. "What happened?" he asked. "The investigators," she said. "The federal team. They're hitting a wall on the vehicle identification." Mason went still. "What vehicle?" "The one that was following me last night. We had partial footage from a highway camera, a vehicle that was behind me for about 40 minutes before I stopped. My team has been trying to identify it all morning." She set the marker down. "They have the make and approximate model, but the plates were obscured, deliberately obscured. Mud or something similar applied to the lower section of both rear and front plates. They can't get a full read." "Footage from where?" "What camera?" Mason asked. "Highway 9 northbound. There's a traffic management camera at the junction with County Road 7. It caught the vehicle at 2 angles." "Can I see it?" Scarlett looked at him. Chen across the room also looked at him. "You're welcome to look," Scarlett said carefully. "But my investigator has already run the footage through every standard vehicle database we have access to, and a former law enforcement consultant we brought in this morning couldn't get anything definitive." "I'm not looking for the plates," Mason said. "I'm looking at the vehicle." Chen pulled up the footage on one of the laptops without being asked. Quick, efficient, not arguing about it. Mason pulled up a chair and sat down. The footage was grainy, as highway camera footage usually is, but adequate. 2 angles, as Scarlett had said. The vehicle was large, not as large as a full-size truck, but substantial. Dark color. Impossible to say definitively in the low-contrast footage, whether it was black or dark blue or dark green. It moved steadily, maintaining a consistent distance from the Mercedes, which was the kind of discipline that suggested someone doing it on purpose rather than just a coincidental car traveling the same road. Mason leaned in close to the screen. He watched the clip through once, then asked Chen to play it again from the beginning and pause at specific moments. He was looking at the wheel arches. He was looking at the roofline profile. He was looking at the way the vehicle sat under load, the ride height, the suspension geometry, the slight forward lean on acceleration that told you something about where the engine weight was and what kind of drivetrain was underneath. He was also looking at something else, something smaller, something you'd miss if you weren't a mechanic. The right rear wheel. There was a very faint light-colored mark on it. Not a hubcap. This vehicle didn't have hubcaps, it had alloy wheels. But there was a discoloration on the inner edge of the alloy. The kind of thing you get when a wheel has been rebalanced recently and the adhesive weight has been positioned in a specific way and left a residue mark. It was barely visible. It was the kind of thing that existed in the footage because the camera had caught a fraction of a second where the angle and the ambient light from an overhead highway lamp had combined just right to make it visible. Mason stared at it for a long moment. "Can you get me a measurement?" he asked Chen. "Wheel diameter, estimated from the footage against the known curb height at that junction." Chen looked at him, then at Scarlett, then back at him. "I can try," she said. "If you can get me within an inch," he said, "I can tell you what I'm looking at." He sat back and rubbed his eyes. His coffee from this morning was long gone, and he had the beginning of a tension headache sitting behind his right temple. But something in the footage was pulling at him the same way the tire marks had pulled at him last night. The same low-level mechanical alarm that said, "This doesn't add up the way you're being told it adds up. This is something specific." He just needed the number. From upstairs, faint and clear through the ceiling, came the sound of Emma talking to Gerald about the fountain. Mason looked up at the ceiling for a second, and something in his expression must have shifted, because Scarlett, watching him from across the room, said quietly, "She's fine up there." "I know," he said. "You can go check on her." "I will, in a minute." He looked back at the screen. "Get me that measurement first." Chen was already working on it, pulling up a separate program, running the geometry. Scarlett crossed her arms and watched Mason with the same look she'd given him last night when he told her the tire was cut. That look of someone reevaluating an assumption they'd started out with. The room was quiet except for the clicking of Chen's keyboard and the distant sound of a child's voice drifting down from upstairs, filling in the corners of a house that had too many of them. Outside the windows, Rollins was doing a perimeter walk. The cameras watched the tree line. The gate at the end of the driveway was closed. The sun was fully up now, and the storm of last night was completely gone. The sky washed clean and blue as a held breath. Mason kept his eyes on the screen. Whatever had followed Scarlett Whitmore down Highway 9 in the dark was somewhere in that footage. And somewhere in 12 years of looking at vehicles, of feeling vibrations, and reading wear patterns, and hearing the things engines said when they thought nobody was paying attention, Mason Carter had the beginning of an answer that nobody else in that room was equipped to find. He just hadn't put it all together yet. Chen got him the measurement 20 minutes later. She'd pulled the frame data from the highway camera archive and cross-referenced the curb height at the County Road 7 junction against the vehicle's wheel diameter using a photogrammetry tool that Mason hadn't known existed until he watched her use it. The number she gave him was 19.4 inches, which she said carried a margin of error of roughly half an inch in either direction. Mason wrote it down on the corner of a notepad she had on the table. 19 to 20 inches. Alloy wheels. That rebalancing mark on the inner edge. The ride height. The suspension geometry he'd watched on the footage. The way the vehicle absorbed the road. The particular kind of body roll it showed in the one moment where the highway camera caught it, taking the gentle curve near the junction. The forward weight distribution on acceleration. He sat with those numbers and those observations for a few minutes, turning them over the way he turned over an engine diagnosis. Not rushing it, not jumping to a conclusion, letting the evidence stack itself in the right order. Then he said, "It's a modified Chevrolet Suburban, late model, probably 2019 or 2020, but the suspension has been changed out. Aftermarket lift with a specific geometry correction package, the kind you put on a vehicle when you've added significant weight to it, and you need the ride height to stay consistent under load." He tapped the notepad. The rebalancing mark on the rear alloy is consistent with a wheel that's been remounted recently. When you add that much weight to a vehicle, the balance changes and you have to redo it. The room was quiet. Scarlett and Chen were both looking at him. One of the other men, the one who'd been on the laptop, had stopped typing. "What kind of weight?" Chen asked. "Armor plating," Mason said. "Not factory. Aftermarket. The kind of job where you pull the panels, add composite or steel sheet to the inside of the doors and the floor, and sometimes the roof, then put it back together. It's not cheap and it's not common, but it's also not rare. There are maybe a dozen shops in the state that do quality work like that." He looked at Scarlett. "You find the shop that did this vehicle, you find who paid for it." Another beat of silence. Scarlett unfolded her arms. Something had shifted in her posture, a tightening that looked less like stress and more like focus. "How confident are you?" "On the vehicle type?" 85%. "On the modification?" He thought about it honestly, the way a mechanic thinks about a diagnosis before he commits to it. The suspension signature is hard to fake on footage. The geometry correction tells you everything. You only make that specific change when you have a very specific problem. So yeah, confident. Chen was already moving. She pulled up a different screen and started typing, and Mason could see from where he was sitting that she was running a search, not a public database, something more restricted, the kind of access that came with either federal credentials or very good lawyers or both. "Aftermarket armoring shops," she said, more to herself than to the room. "State-licensed, past 5 years, suburban-class vehicles. Cross-reference for any work done in the 2019 to 2020 model year range," Mason added. "And look for shops that do military or government contract work alongside private clients." The quality of what I saw on that footage. The geometry correction was done by someone who knew what they were doing. That's not a backyard operation. Chen nodded without looking up. Scarlett walked over to Mason and stood beside him, looking at the frozen frame on the laptop screen. The dark vehicle on the highway, caught in the amber wash of the overhead light, the small pale mark on the inner rim almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. "How do you know about aftermarket armoring?" she asked. "I don't, much. But 3 years ago a client brought me a vehicle that had had plate work done and needed the suspension recalibrated afterward. The shop that did the armoring had done the geometry wrong and it was eating tires." He shrugged. "I fixed it. Asked a lot of questions. That's how I know." "You just remember things like that." "I remember things that are interesting mechanically," he said. "It's not a skill. It's just, I can't turn it off." She was quiet for a moment. "The investigators this morning," she said. "The federal team. 2 of them have 15-plus years in financial crimes. Chen has a background in forensic accounting. Rollins has military intelligence. And you fix cars, he said. Fix cars, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite irony, but wasn't quite admiration either, something in between. And you found this in 40 minutes. I found a direction, he said. Chen finds the shop. That's different. Still, he didn't answer that. From upstairs, the sound of Emma's footsteps crossing the floor above them. The particular rhythm of a 6-year-old who had decided it was time to do something and was moving with purpose. A moment later, her voice, muffled by the ceiling, "Daddy, can we do the fountain now?" Mason looked up, then at the door, then at Scarlett. "Go," she said simply. He found Emma at the top of the stairs with Gerald under one arm and her sneakers already on, laced unevenly in the way she insisted on doing herself. She'd also put Gerald's red hat on at some point, which she was wearing herself now, pushed down over her ears. "That's Gerald's hat," Mason said. "He said I could borrow it," Emma said, with complete confidence. He took her out through the side door that led to the garden. Rollins appeared from somewhere and walked a discreet distance behind them, which Emma noticed and chose not to comment on, which meant she'd decided Rollins was all right. That was Emma's way. Once she'd made up her mind about a person, she stopped making a production of them. The fountain was stone, older than the house's current renovation, with a shallow basin and a simple vertical column that let water fall in a continuous curtain into the pool below. Emma stood at the edge and looked into it for a long time without touching anything, which was unusual for her. Then she put her hand in the edge of the falling water, felt it, pulled her hand back and looked at the water on her palm. "It's cold," she said. "Fountains usually are." "I thought it would be warm, like a bath. Different kind of water." She thought about this. Then she looked up at him with the kind of expression that meant she was going to ask something she'd been holding on to. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" Mason crouched down to her level. The gravel crunched under his boots. "What makes you say that?" "Because we left fast," she said. "And there are lots of men with ear things. And you had the same face you had when we had to move from the other apartment. The face where you don't know what to say." He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, wearing a stolen red elephant hat, holding a one-eyed stuffed animal, standing at the edge of a fountain in a stranger's garden, while a man with an earpiece watched from 20 feet away. She was smarter than he gave her credit for, which was something he was learning in real time on a fairly regular basis. "There's a situation," he said carefully, "but we're safe here. I promise you that." "Is the lady in trouble, Scarlett?" "She's working on it." "Are you helping her?" "Trying to." Emma nodded once, solemnly. "Okay," she said. She turned back to the fountain and put both hands in the water this time, up to the wrists, and then made a small sound of surprise and satisfaction that had nothing to do with trouble or security teams or anything that had happened in the last 24 hours. It was just cold water and a stone fountain and the uncomplicated pleasure of a kid finding something interesting. Mason stayed crouched beside her for a moment, watching her. Then he sat down on the fountain edge and let her play, and tried to let his brain go quiet for 5 minutes, which it mostly didn't. By early afternoon, Chen had a list. It was shorter than Mason would have guessed. 7 shops in the state that met the criteria. Licensed aftermarket armoring, quality work. Experience with the suburban class vehicle range, operating within the last 5 years. She put the list on the whiteboard in the side room and stood back and looked at it. "We can start with the 4 closest to the city," she said. "The other 3 are upstate, and it's less likely, given that the vehicle was operating in this metro area." "Or it's exactly where you'd go if you didn't want to use a local shop," Rollins said from the doorway. He'd come back in from outside, and he had the dry, unhurried manner of someone who'd spent a lot of time finding flaws in plans. "The point of this vehicle was specifically not to be found." "Both things are true," Scarlett said. "So we check all 7, Mason said. Chen looked at him. "Even if we locate the shop, they're not going to hand over client records." "No," he agreed. "But shops keep physical records. And shops leave physical evidence. Paint transfer, waste oil logs, parts invoices, custom fabrication records. The armoring modification requires specific composite materials that have to be ordered and invoiced. Someone paid for those materials, and that payment is a number that connects to something." He thought for a second. "Also, the geometry correction package I mentioned. That's a proprietary kit. There are only 3 manufacturers who make it in the right spec for a suburban class vehicle, and they all have distribution records. The room was quiet again. It was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the quiet of people waiting for something, but the quiet of people recalibrating. Chen wrote something on the whiteboard. Rollins moved further into the room. Scarlett was looking at Mason with an expression he'd started to recognize, the one she got when she was deciding something, when the calculation was running behind her eyes and she was waiting for it to finish before she said anything out loud. "The federal team has subpoena authority," she said finally. "If we give them a specific enough target, they can compel the distribution records," Chen finished. "Yes." "How long?" "If we call right now, couple of hours for an emergency subpoena on commercial records. It's faster than people think when there's an active federal investigation already in motion." Scarlett picked up her phone, walked out of the room. Mason sat back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck. The tension headache had settled in properly now, sitting behind both eyes, and he had the particular kind of tired that came not from physical exhaustion, but from the concentrated effort of holding a lot of information in your head at once and turning it over from every angle. He was used to doing that with engines. He was less used to doing it with people who wanted to harm other people, and the stakes felt different in a way that he kept having to consciously not think about too directly. He thought about the eviction notice on the counter at home instead. That was at least a problem that existed in a context he understood. Chen appeared beside him with a cup of coffee, black, which was lucky because he would have accepted it either way. "You doing all right?" she asked. He looked up. It was a surprisingly human question from someone who'd been operating in professional efficiency mode for the last several hours. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." She sat down in the chair across from him. For a moment, she wasn't the forensic accountant running database searches. She was just a person sitting across a table. "You have a good eye," she said. "I've worked with a lot of consultants, former FBI, former military analysts, people who've spent their whole careers doing exactly this kind of identification work. Most of them would have looked at that footage and called it inconclusive." "They're looking for different things," Mason said. "What do you mean?" "They're looking for identifiers, plates, badges, registration marks, things that live in databases. I'm looking at how something moves, how it sits, what it's been through." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "A car tells you things if you let it. Most people don't let it." Chen considered this. "And people, do people tell you things the same way?" He thought about it. "Sometimes. Emma does. She told me this morning that she knew something was wrong because I had a specific face. I didn't know I had that face." "Kids are better at reading that than adults," Chen said. "We learn to stop looking." He didn't answer that, but he thought it was probably true. The afternoon moved in that strange, lurching way that tense situations produce, long stretches of waiting interrupted by sharp moments of activity. Scarlett came back from her phone call, then went to another room for a video conference that Rollins stood outside of. Chen worked steadily at her laptop. Mason took Emma for a walk around the property perimeter, the safe interior perimeter, well inside the camera line, and let her collect interesting shaped stones, which she was arranging on the window seat in her room by what criteria he couldn't determine, but that she seemed clear on. At 3:40 in the afternoon, Chen came to find him. She didn't say anything, just looked at him from the doorway of the room where he'd been sitting with a magazine he wasn't reading, and the look was enough. He followed her back to the side room. The whiteboard had new information on it. One of the 7 shops had been circled in red marker. "Meridian Custom Works," Chen said, "operates out of an industrial park about 60 miles northeast of the city. They do legitimate contract work, private security firms, some government-adjacent contracts, clean on the surface." "And not on the surface?" Mason asked. "The kit manufacturer's subpoena came through 40 minutes ago. Meridian ordered a geometry correction package consistent with your specifications in September of last year, paid for with a corporate card registered to a shell company called Harlow Logistics LLC. She looked at her notepad. Harlow Logistics was incorporated 18 months ago. It has one listed officer. His name is Daniel Frick. Scarlett was standing at the whiteboard. She hadn't moved since Mason came in. At the name Frick, something in her face changed. A small, controlled change, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching, but Mason was watching. "Who's Daniel Frick?" he asked. "Gerald Holt's chief of operations," Scarlett said. Her voice was level in the way that a very straight line is level, achieved through effort, not natural. "He's been with Holt for 11 years. He runs every logistical operation connected to Holt's division." She paused. "He's also the man who would have known my route last night, because he sits in on executive security briefings." The pieces connected in the room like a sequence of locks turning. Mason looked at the circled name on the whiteboard, then at Scarlett, then at Chen. "So Holt used Frick's shell company to pay for the armored vehicle," he said. "And Frick knew the route because he had access to the security briefings." "That's what the evidence currently supports," Chen said carefully. "It's not a conviction, but it's a thread. A specific, real thread that leads somewhere." "The federal investigators need this," Scarlett said. She was already picking up her phone. "They need more than a shell company payment," Rollins said. He'd appeared in the doorway sometime in the last minute, as he had a way of doing. "Frick will say the shell company was for legitimate purposes. Holt will say the armored vehicle was a security measure, nothing more. You need to connect the vehicle physically, put it at the scene." "The dash cam," Mason said. Everyone looked at him. He'd said it without entirely meaning to, and now that he'd said it, he was working through it as he spoke. "My truck. I've got a dash cam. It's a cheap one. Been on the windshield for 2 years. I mostly forget it's there, but last night when I stopped on Highway 9, the camera was recording. It records continuously and overwrites every 72 hours. He paused. "I haven't accessed it since last night." The silence in the room was sudden and complete. "If that vehicle was in the area when you stopped," Chen said slowly, "if it was anywhere in your camera's range, I had my headlights on and my brakes lit up when I stopped. If they were watching the Mercedes, they were somewhere behind me on that road." He was doing the geometry in his head, the camera's field of view, the camera placement on the windshield, the angle, the distance at which headlights would be visible in the frame. "It might be nothing, but if they were within a quarter mile, they'll be on the footage." "Your truck is at your apartment," Rollins said. "The camera's memory card is in the camera," Mason said, "which is in my truck." Rollins looked at Scarlett. She looked at Mason. "I'll send 2 people," Rollins said. "I'm going," Mason said. "That's not—" "I need to pull the card myself," Mason said, and his voice had the same quiet quality it had when he'd told them he was driving his own truck. "I've had issues with that camera before. The card sticks. You have to know the right way to pull it, or you risk corrupting the read buffer. It needs to be me." It wasn't entirely a lie. The card did stick sometimes. Whether that was sufficient reason to go back to an apartment that might be watched was a different question, and everyone in the room knew it, and nobody said it out loud. Rollins made the call, and they left at 4:15. Mason, Rollins, and a second man named Avery, who rode in the back of the Tahoe and hadn't said more than 12 words to Mason in total. Mason rode in front this time. He watched the mirrors without trying to be obvious about it, and Rollins watched them without trying to hide it. The drive back to the city was 40 minutes. The apartment complex looked exactly as it always looked. The cracked asphalt in the lot, the overgrown hedge along the building's east side that the management company sent someone to trim twice a year whether it needed it or not, the cluster of metal mailboxes by the entrance with the one that had been slightly dented since before Mason moved in. His truck was where he'd left it. Rollins did a pass through the lot before Mason got out, slow, looking at every parked vehicle. Then he parked 3 spaces over and nodded. Mason got out and went to his truck. The dash cam was on the windshield where it always was, a small, square, entirely unremarkable device that had been there so long it had become invisible, the kind of thing you stop seeing because you see it every day. He popped the housing, and the card did stick just slightly, and he worked it free with his thumbnail the way he always did. He held it in his palm, small as a thumbnail. A standard Class 10 micro SD with 72 hours of continuous footage that hadn't been overwritten yet because Mason drove his truck maybe 3 times a week, and the camera hadn't had occasion to loop. He walked back to the Tahoe and got in. They went back. The footage review took 2 hours. Chen ran the card through a recovery program first, Standard procedure, she said, to ensure the file structure was intact before they opened anything, and then began working through the footage from the previous night, timestamp by timestamp, starting from when Mason had left the shop at 9:14 p.m. and working forward. Mason sat beside her and watched. Most of it was nothing. Highway footage at night is mostly darkness and headlights and the hypnotic repetition of center lines. The rain made everything worse. The camera's night mode fought with the water on the windshield, producing a blurry, stuttering image that required Chen to process certain frames through a clarity algorithm before anything was legible. They found the moment Mason slowed down and pulled to the shoulder at 10:23 p.m. They could see the Mercedes' hazard lights ahead, orange pulses in the rain. They could see Mason's headlights illuminate the car as he backed up toward it. And then Chen said, "There." She paused the footage and pointed at the upper left corner of the frame. In the far background, past the Mercedes, past the edge of the highway shoulder, almost at the edge of the camera's range, two small points of light. Not moving. Stationary, positioned slightly off the road surface in the way that a vehicle pulled to the far shoulder would be. Parking lights. The parking lights of a vehicle that had stopped when Mason stopped, pulled back when he pulled back, and was sitting in the dark, waiting. Chen ran the clarity algorithm on the frame. The image sharpened imperfectly, the way enhanced footage always does. Not the clean Hollywood version, but the real version, where you get slightly less blur and slightly more detail, and you have to look hard to find what matters. What mattered was the shape behind those parking lights, the high roof line, the wide rear wheel arches, the particular silhouette of a large, heavy vehicle sitting lower than its size would suggest, the way an armored vehicle sits when the added weight has been accounted for in the suspension, but not entirely overcome. There was a second frame, 8 seconds later, where Mason's backup lights had swept across the road behind him as he maneuvered to position his headlights on the Mercedes, and in that white-lit half-second the vehicle in the background was briefly, partially visible. Not clearly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to see the alloy wheel on the driver's side rear. Enough to see a pale mark on the inner edge. Mason leaned close to the screen. His heart was doing something irregular that he was going to ignore. "That's the same wheel," he said. Chen zoomed in. The image degraded further, but the mark was there. The same asymmetric discoloration on the inner rim edge that he'd identified in the highway camera footage that morning. "Same vehicle," Chen said quietly. "Same vehicle," Mason confirmed. "That puts it at the scene. At that location, at that time, watching that car." Chen leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. "Combined with the Harlow logistics payment for the armoring kit," she said, "and the shell company traced to Frick—" "This isn't circumstantial anymore," Mason said. "No," she said, "it isn't." He sat back too. The room felt different than it had 2 hours ago. Not quieter, exactly. Chen was already pulling up the federal investigator's contact, already typing a summary, already compiling the file. But there was a different quality to the activity. Less searching, more arrived. He thought about those parking lights sitting in the dark at the edge of his camera's range. He thought about the patience of it. Someone had been in that vehicle for 40 minutes or more, tracking the Mercedes, waiting for it to go off the road at the right moment. And when a random truck had stopped instead, they'd had to stay put, stay dark, stay patient, and then follow Mason home and sit outside his apartment and decide whether he was a problem. He was apparently a problem. He got up and went to find Emma. She was in the main room, which had been briefly reclaimed from the investigative team for her benefit. Someone had moved the laptops to one side and found a box of craft supplies from somewhere in the house, and Emma was at the cleared end of the long table with colored paper and safety scissors and a glue stick, making something complex and architectural that involved multiple layers and what appeared to be significant planning. Rollins was sitting in the armchair near the window, ostensibly looking at his phone, actually keeping an eye on the room. Emma looked up when Mason came in. She assessed him the way she'd been doing since this morning, with the same careful attention to his face, with whatever she found there seemed acceptable. "I'm making Scarlett a thank you card," she announced, "because she let us stay here." "That's good of you," Mason said. He came over and looked at the card, which was elaborate. There were multiple cutout shapes and what appeared to be an attempt at a fountain, slightly abstract. "Is that the fountain?" "That's Gerald," Emma said, pointing at a rounded blue shape. Gerald is blue? In the card he is, she said, with the tone of someone clarifying a basic point. It's art, Daddy. Things can be different in art. Right, he said. Sorry. He sat down across from her and watched her work for a few minutes. The craft supplies, he noticed, were good quality. Not the dried-out glue sticks and crumbling scissors you got at the dollar store, but actual children's art materials, the kind that worked. Someone had gone and gotten them, probably since this morning, specifically for Emma. He didn't know who. Daddy, Emma said, without looking up from the card. Is it going to be okay? He told her it was safe here. He told her they were helping someone. He'd been honest in the ways he could be honest with a 6-year-old. But she was asking something slightly different now, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. Yeah, he said, it's going to be okay. She looked up at him then. Her eyes were her mother's. The same shape, the same quality of attention in them, the same way they held on you like they were reading the fine print. Promise? He held her gaze. Promise. She held his for another second, making her assessment, and then went back to the card with the confidence of someone who had received a satisfactory answer and was moving on. The scissors made their small cutting sound. Gerald sat on the table watching the proceedings with his single eye. Mason stayed there until Scarlett appeared in the doorway and said quietly, "The federal team needs to see you. Now." He looked at his daughter. She was fine. She was making a card. "I'll be right back," he told her. "Okay," she said, not looking up. "Tell them hello from me." He almost smiled. "I will." In the side room, the federal investigator, a woman named Vasquez who had driven out from the city in under an hour, was standing with Chen and Rollins looking at the combined evidence on Chen's screen. She had a phone in one hand and a legal pad in the other, and the manner of someone who was holding a lot of very fast-moving information in place through sheer professional discipline. She looked at Mason when he came in. "You identified the vehicle," she said. It wasn't a question. "I identified the type and modification," he said. Chen traced it. "Tell me about the dashcam footage." He told her. She listened without interrupting, which he respected. And when he finished, she looked back at the screen and at the still frame Chen had pulled up. The grainy, partially enhanced image of a dark, suburban-shaped vehicle sitting in the rain at the edge of a highway with parking lights on. "The rim mark," Vasquez said. "You're confident it's the same vehicle." "I'm confident the mark is consistent with what I identified in the highway camera footage, yes," Mason said. "If you get a forensic vehicle analyst to compare both frames, they'll confirm it. I'm a mechanic, not a forensic expert." Vasquez looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she found the distinction he was drawing between himself and a forensic expert slightly unnecessary. "We're executing a search of Meridian Custom Works tomorrow morning," she said. "If the vehicle is there, or if physical evidence of the modification work is present, combined with the Harlow Logistics payment trail and this footage..." She stopped. "This is significant, Mr. Carter." "It's a thread," Mason said, which was what Chen had called it. "You pull it." "We intend to." She turned back to the screen and started talking to Chen about file formats and chain of custody protocols for the dashcam footage. Mason stepped back and stood near the wall for a moment. The room continued around him. Vasquez on her phone, Chen typing, Rollins conferring with someone in a low voice near the door. The investigation that Scarlett had spent 6 months building in secret, the one that powerful men had sabotaged a car and parked outside a mechanic's apartment to stop, was now moving with the kind of momentum that came from evidence. Real, physical, specific evidence that hadn't existed in this form 24 hours ago. And it existed because a mechanic had looked at a tire in the rain and noticed that the cut was wrong. Because the same mechanic had noticed a wheel mark in grainy security footage. Because a dash cam that cost $47 and had been stuck to a windshield for 2 years and mostly recorded parking lot dents and near misses on the highway had been running that night on Highway 9 when a dark vehicle had pulled to the shoulder and turned off its lights. Mason was not the kind of man who thought about the shape of events. He fixed things. He paid bills when he could and deferred them when he couldn't. He got Emma to school and picked her up and made eggs or cereal and listened to her talk about elephants being afraid of mice. He didn't think in terms of fate or meaning or things happening for reasons. But standing in that room, Listening to Vasquez give instructions that were going to unravel a $100 million fraud, he had a brief, clear, unwanted thought that he couldn't entirely shake. That all of it, the whole chain of it, had started because he couldn't drive past something that didn't look right. He didn't know what to do with that thought, so he pushed it aside and went back to the main room to see how Emma's card was coming along. It was, by her assessment, almost done. It needed one more thing, she said, and she was working on it with focused concentration. She had both elbows on the table and her tongue was pressed to her upper lip, which was what happened when she was being precise. The one more thing, it turned out, was a small figure she was cutting out of yellow paper. Not a person, not an animal. When she held it up and he asked what it was, she said, without any particular drama, "It's a truck, like yours, because that's how we got here." Mason looked at the small yellow paper truck in his daughter's hand. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going gold and long across the garden, catching the water in the fountain, making it shine. The estate was quiet. The gate was closed. For the first time since 10:30 the previous night, Mason Carter was not making a calculation or a diagnosis or a decision. He was just sitting at a table with his daughter in the late afternoon light, watching her glue a yellow paper truck onto a thank you card. It was enough. For right now, it was enough. The search of Meridian Custom Works happened at 6:15 the following morning. Mason didn't know this until Vasquez called Scarlett at 7:40, and the news moved through the estate in that specific way that significant news moves through a contained space. Not announced, not broadcast, but felt, the way you feel a change in air pressure before you hear the thunder. Rollins came out of the side room with his jaw set differently than it had been. Chen closed her laptop and opened it again immediately. Scarlett stood in the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear and her free hand flat on the counter, and whatever Vasquez was telling her she was receiving without expression, the way you receive something you've been waiting a long time for and are afraid to react to in case it disappears. Mason was in the kitchen too, making Emma's breakfast. Cereal, because they were working with whatever the estate's kitchen had, and it had a surprising amount of cereal for a house that appeared to belong to a single person. Emma was at the kitchen table with Gerald and the thank you card she'd finished the previous evening, which she'd placed face up on the table and was periodically checking on, as if it might change. He poured milk and set the bowl in front of Emma and watched Scarlett's face and waited. She ended the call. She stood with her phone at her side for a moment. "They found it," she said, not loud, almost to herself. "The vehicle?" Mason asked. "The vehicle. In a secondary bay at the back of the property, covered. They also found the tooling used for the armoring workshop records, and—" She stopped and breathed once, carefully. "Material consistent with the compound used to score a tire sidewall, a precision tool, narrow blade, good steel. Exactly what you described." The kitchen was quiet for a second. Emma looked up from her cereal, read the room with 6-year-old accuracy, and went back to eating without saying anything. "Frick?" Mason asked. "Taken into custody this morning at his residence. He's talking to federal investigators now." Scarlett set her phone on the counter. There was something in the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Or maybe it had been there, and the forward motion of events had kept Mason from seeing it. A specific kind of exhaustion that comes from a long time of carrying something alone. "They're moving on Holt this afternoon. Board notification is required by the company's own charter before any executive action, which means you have to walk into a room with those people," Mason said. She looked at him. "Yes." He thought about that for a second, about what it would mean to sit in a room with people who had tried to have you killed, knowing what you knew, having to hold yourself together in the professional context of a board meeting while federal investigators waited outside. About the particular kind of nerve that required, which was different from physical courage and in some ways harder. "When?" he asked. "This afternoon. The meeting is at 2. She picked up her phone again, not to use it, just to have something in her hands. "Vasquez's team will be present. Chen will have the full evidence presentation ready. It should be—" She stopped. "What?" "I was going to say it should be straightforward," she said, "but nothing about this has been straightforward, so I'm not going to say that." "Smart," Mason said. Something close to a real smile crossed her face. Small, brief, but real. Then she was back to business, and she left the kitchen to find Chen and Mason sat down across from Emma and drank his coffee. Is she going somewhere? Emma asked. Later today, yeah. Is she going to be okay? He thought about Scarlett Whitmore walking into a boardroom at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to dismantle the professional lives of men who'd put an assassin on her road 3 nights ago. She's going to be fine, he said. Emma looked at him with her mother's eyes. You said that the same way you said I was a good driver when I was steering the shopping cart. You are a good driver. Daddy. Yeah, he said. She's going to be fine. Emma appeared to accept this as the honest version and returned to her cereal. The morning had a waiting quality to it that Mason didn't know what to do with. He was not by nature a man who waited well. His whole professional life was structured around tasks. There was always something to do in a shop, always something that needed attention, and the physical rhythm of work had become so built into him that the absence of it felt like a low-level static in his chest. He offered to help Chen and was politely redirected. He checked in with Rollins on the property perimeter and was told everything was clean. He called Harold about the Subaru and got voicemail and left an apology that probably sounded as inadequate as it was. At 10 in the morning, he went and sat with his legal pad at the kitchen table and tried to think through what, practically, came next. The shop. That was the most concrete thing. He had clients who'd been canceled and needed rescheduling. He had an equipment loan payment that was now 4 days further past due than it'd been on Tuesday. He had a landlord's agent who had stopped returning calls and a process that had a legal timeline he was running out of. The eviction notice was still on his kitchen counter at home. He hadn't opened it. He still knew the number. He wrote these things down in a list, not because making a list helped solve them, but because writing them down meant they were real and accounted for, and he wasn't pretending they didn't exist. That was the thing about debt and falling behind. It tempted you to look away from it, to deal with the urgent thing in front of you and handle the slow disaster later, and later had a way of becoming too late before you noticed. He was looking at the list when Scarlett came back into the kitchen. She'd changed clothes. The thing she'd been wearing for the past 2 days, the same jacket, progressively more worn, was gone, replaced by something sharper, more deliberate. She'd done something with her hair. She looked, in a word that Mason would not have used but was accurate, composed. The composure was real and also effortful, and he could see both things at once, which he thought said something about how long they'd now been in close proximity under abnormal circumstances. She saw the legal pad. Is that about the shop? She asked. He hadn't meant for her to see it, not because it was secret, but because it was private. The specific, practical shape of a life that was struggling, and he didn't want anyone's pity, and Scarlett Whitmore's pity, in particular, was something he had a specific resistance to. Just organizing, he said, and moved his coffee cup over it. She sat down across from him anyway. I'm not going to insult you, she said. I know what the next thing you're going to say is, and I want to go on record that I'm aware of it. You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to say you're fine, she said, or some version of that. That you've got it handled, that you don't need anything. He didn't say anything. Because you've been running on that for... She paused. How long has it been hard? He looked at her. That's a personal question? Yes, she said simply, without apology. How long? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was bright in the morning sun, the fountain running, the stone catching the light. Since my wife died, he said, which is 3 years. Before that it was fine. Not easy, but fine. After, he stopped. There were words for what came after, but he didn't feel like arranging them right now. It's been a process. How old was Emma when it happened? 3. Scarlett was quiet. She wasn't performing sympathy. She wasn't making a face or tilting her head or any of the things people do when they don't know what to say and are trying to look like they do. She was just sitting with it, which he found easier to tolerate than the alternative. Lauren, he said. He didn't know why he said the name. He almost never said the name to strangers. Her name was Lauren. She sounds like she was someone real, Scarlett said. It was a strange thing to say. He thought about it and decided it was the right thing to say. She was, he said. Very. They sat there for a moment in the kitchen with the fountain running outside and Emma in the next room talking quietly to Gerald about something. And it was the closest thing to a normal human moment that Mason had experienced since Tuesday night, which felt now like something that happened in a different chapter of his life. Then Scarlett's phone went off, and the moment ended and they were back in the forward motion of the day. Chen needed her. The evidence presentation required a final review, and there were two specific financial records that the federal team had flagged overnight that Scarlett needed to annotate with context before the meeting. Scarlett stood up, smoothed her jacket, picked up her phone, and was already moving when she paused in the kitchen doorway and turned back. "Mason?" He looked up. "I'm going to ask you something after this is over," she said. "You don't have to say yes, but I want you to hear me out before you say anything." He waited. "That's it," she said. "That's all I'm saying right now." She left. He sat there with his coffee and his legal pad and the feeling of a door that had been opened just enough to let some light through without showing you what was on the other side. Emma came into the kitchen with Gerald under her arm. She climbed into the chair across from him and set Gerald on the table and looked at her father. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just sitting here." "Okay." "You had the thinking face." "What thinking face?" "The one where you look at things but you're not seeing them," she said. "Like when you look at the car engine for a really long time before you touch it." He stared at his daughter. "You're very observant, you know that?" "I know," she said contentedly, and reached for his legal pad. "Can I draw on this?" "There's writing on it." "On the back," she said, already flipping it. He let her have it. The convoy left for the city at noon. Scarlett, Chen, Vasquez, and two members of the federal team went in two vehicles, Rollins driving the lead car. Two of Vasquez's people stayed at the estate. Mason stayed at the estate. He didn't offer to come. It wasn't his meeting, wasn't his world, and showing up to a corporate board meeting in work boots and jeans would have been absurd regardless of what he'd contributed to getting here. He stood at the front window and watched the cars go down the driveway and through the gate and disappear into the tree line. And then he went and found Emma, and they spent an hour at the fountain, which she had elevated to her primary interest in the property. She'd developed a specific technique for placing her hands in the falling water to create a different sound, and she was iterating on this technique with the kind of methodical persistence that Mason recognized as genetic. At 1:40, he got a text from Scarlett. Just 2 words. "Going in." He looked at it for a moment and typed back, "You've got this," which was the kind of thing he didn't usually say and meant nonetheless. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to the fountain. The Whitmore Capital Group boardroom occupied the 42nd floor of the company's downtown headquarters, a building that Scarlett's grandfather had broken ground on 40 years ago, and that her father had expanded twice, and that she had run for the past 6 years since taking the reins at 24 in circumstances that most people in the industry had loudly predicted would end badly. They'd been wrong, which was something she hadn't forgotten and didn't bring up, because she'd learned early that competence announced by results was more durable than competence announced by words. The board members were already seated when she walked in. 9 people around an oval table, the kind of table that cost more than most people's cars, and was intended to communicate exactly that. Some of them looked up when she entered. Some of them were already looking, which told her things about who knew what and who'd been warned. Gerald Holt was at the far end. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the particular brand of confident stillness that powerful men in expensive suits cultivate over decades. The studied ease of a man who has won enough rooms to know how to sit in one. He met Scarlett's eyes when she came in and held her gaze with an expression of professional neutrality that she recognized immediately as a performance. You couldn't spend 4 years working near someone without learning what their real face looked like, and this was not his real face. His real face was underneath it, and it was doing a calculation. 2 of the other board members, Price and Cunningham, the other names on her list of 3, were sitting together on the left side of the table and were doing a worse job of the neutrality. Price was touching his water glass. Cunningham had his hands flat on the table in the way people put their hands flat when they're telling themselves to keep still. Vasquez's people were in the room, not at the table, positioned near the door and along the far wall, with the particular quality of presence that said they were there officially and intended to remain. The board's chair, a 70-year-old woman named Hargrove, who had been on this board for 12 years, and who Scarlett trusted in the limited way that you trust someone whose interests have consistently overlapped with your own, called the meeting to order at 2:03. Scarlett stood up. She didn't open with pleasantries. She didn't do a preamble about the seriousness of the situation or an apology for the extraordinary nature of the meeting. She simply said, "Over the course of the past 6 months, I have gathered evidence of a systematic financial fraud within this company's senior executive structure, amounting to the theft of approximately $400 million in company assets. That evidence has been in the hands of federal investigators since Tuesday night. I'm going to present the key points to this board now, with Chen available to walk through the full financial documentation." She could feel the room shift. Not the whole room. Hargrove hadn't moved, and 2 other board members who'd been briefed peripherally were steady. But the room's middle, the people who hadn't known and were now being told, shifted in their chairs the way people shift when something much larger than they expected suddenly takes up all the available space. Holt said, "Scarlett, this is highly irregular." "Gerald," she said, and her voice was even and clear and carried none of the 48 hours of storms and sabotage and federal briefings and a 6-year-old's fountain and a mechanic's legal pad that had produced this moment. "I'd strongly advise you to be quiet." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that fills a room completely. Chen stepped forward and connected her laptop to the board table's presentation system, and the main screen at the head of the room came alive with the first slide. Financial records, transaction histories, the shell company structure that had siphoned company assets through 11 intermediary accounts over a period of 22 months, the Harlow logistics thread that connected to Meridian Custom Works, that connected to an armored vehicle on a highway, that connected ultimately to a tire cut with a precision blade in the dark. Scarlett walked them through it, all of it. She didn't rush it, and she didn't editorialize. The evidence spoke in the specific, unargumentative language of numbers and dates and verified transaction records, and Chen handled the technical presentation with the methodical precision of someone who had spent weeks making sure every link in the chain was unbreakable. Holt tried 3 times. He tried legal proceduralism first, questioning the admissibility of evidence gathered outside of proper board process. Vasquez handled that one quietly and definitively. He tried personnel authority second, suggesting that the investigators in the room had no jurisdiction over an ongoing board proceeding. That one died faster. The 3rd time he tried something softer, almost personal, appealing to the length of his tenure and his record of service to the company, and Scarlett looked at him across the oval table and said, "Your record is what I'm presenting, Gerald. This is your record." Price broke at the 40-minute mark. Not dramatically, not a confession or a breakdown. He simply stopped arguing. He put his hands on the table and looked at them and stopped talking, which in a room full of people making arguments was its own kind of statement. Cunningham lasted another 10 minutes before his attorney, who had been on a call outside the room and came in looking like a man who'd received very bad news from another direction, leaned down and said something quietly in his ear that ended his participation in the proceedings. Holt lasted until the dashcam footage. Vasquez played it. The grainy, rain-obscured image from Mason's $47 windshield camera, the dark shape at the edge of the highway, the parking lights, and then the brief sweep of Mason's backup lights illuminating the vehicle for 3 seconds, and the mark on the rear alloy wheel that matched Meridian's records exactly. The room was completely quiet. Holt's attorney said something to him in a whisper that Scarlett couldn't hear. Holt didn't respond. He was looking at the screen with an expression that was no longer neutral or performed or calculated. He was looking at a piece of footage shot by a mechanic's cheap dash cam on a rainy highway, and he was understanding what it meant. "Gerald Holt," Vasquez said, "I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit securities fraud, embezzlement of corporate assets, and conspiracy to commit murder in the 1st degree." The words went around the table like a current. 2 of Vasquez's people moved from their positions along the wall. Holt stood up, which surprised everyone, and for a second the room tensed. Then he straightened his jacket with both hands, a gesture so automatic and habitual that it looked almost dignified, and said nothing, and let them take him out of the room. Price and Cunningham were taken separately, 5 minutes apart. The remaining 6 board members sat in the rearranged silence of the room and looked at each other and at Scarlett and at the screen, which Chen had turned off. Hargrove, at the head of the table, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Well," which was, under the circumstances, about as much as needed to be said. Scarlett sat down. She hadn't sat down once during the entire presentation. She sat down now and put both hands flat on the table and breathed. Hargrove looked at her from the far end. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Scarlett said, and then, because she was tired and Hargrove was one of the few people in this room she'd trust with the real answer, "I will be." Hargrove nodded once. That was sufficient. The procedural requirements after an event like this were substantial. Board resolutions, public filings, communication to shareholders, coordination with the Federal Investigations Public Disclosure Timeline, immediate forensic accounting review of every account connected to the 3 arrested executives. Chen was already building the task list. Vasquez's team would be in the building for the rest of the day. Legal would need to be convened. Communications would need to be drafted. Scarlett handled the next 2 hours in the way she handled most things, methodically, personally, without delegating the things that mattered, and without holding on to the things that didn't. She spoke to each remaining board member individually. She called the company's general counsel. She approved the first public statement and rejected the second draft as too corporate and bloodless, and approved a revised version that said what actually happened without hiding from it. At 4:30, she stepped out of the building for the first time since noon. The air outside was cooler than it had been, the long afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the plaza. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her phone in her hand and the residue of the last 72 hours sitting on her like weather. She called Mason. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear water in the background. The fountain, she thought, which made her close her eyes for just a second. "It's done," she said. A beat. "All 3 of them?" "All 3. Holt's in federal custody. Price and Cunningham cooperated at the end, which means they'll get different treatment, but they're done. The assets are being frozen." She paused. "The board is intact. The company is intact." "Good," he said. "Simple. Not making a production of it." "The footage was significant," she said. "Vasquez said it was the piece that removed all remaining ambiguity. The rim mark matching the workshop records put the vehicle at the scene conclusively." "Good," he said again. "Mason." "Yeah." "Thank you," she said. "Not as a formality, not as a social nicety, as a fact. The way you'd state a fact." He was quiet for a moment. "You would have found it," he said. "Eventually." "Maybe," she said, "but it mattered that it was now, not eventually." He didn't argue with that. "How's Emma?" she asked. "Currently explaining to one of your security guys how the fountain works," he said. "He seems engaged." "That's Avery. He has 4 kids." She paused. "She'd probably like him." "She likes most people who take her seriously," Mason said. "She liked Rollins." "Everyone eventually likes Rollins," Scarlett said. "It just takes a while." There was a brief, ordinary silence on the line, the kind that didn't need to be filled. "I'm coming back now," she said, "and I have something I want to say to you." "You mentioned that this morning." "I did." She looked down at the plaza stones, at the shadow of the building stretching long and angular across them. "I've been thinking about how to say it, and I think the honest way is just to say it. Usually the best way," he said. "Your shop," she said, "and everything connected to it. I want to help, not as charity. I'm not—" She stopped. "I know you won't accept charity. I know that in the same way I know the rim mark thing, which is to say I know it without being told, so that's not what I'm offering." She straightened. "I'm offering something different, and I want you to hear it out, when I get back." Another pause. She could hear the fountain behind him. She could hear faintly Emma's voice. "Okay," he said. "I'll hear it." She arrived back at the estate at 6:15. Rollins drove. She was out of the car before it fully stopped, which was a habit she'd never broken, and she went in through the side door and found Emma in the kitchen eating dinner. Someone had made pasta, which was Emma's expressed preference, apparently established through negotiation with the household staff at some point during the afternoon. Emma looked up when Scarlett came in. She assessed her the same way she'd assessed her father, direct, thorough, arriving at a conclusion. Then she pointed at the counter where the thank you card sat. I made you that, she said. It's got a truck because that's how we got here. Scarlett picked it up, looked at it. The fountain in blue. Gerald in blue. The yellow truck with "Thank you" written above it in careful, imperfect 6-year-old letters. She looked at it longer than she'd looked at the financial presentations today, which had been full of numbers that mattered enormously. This is the best card I've ever received, she said. Emma received this with dignity. I used the good scissors, she said. Mason came in from the side room. He'd changed into a clean shirt, which was all he had in terms of preparation for whatever this conversation was going to be. He looked at Scarlett, and Scarlett looked at him, and Emma looked at both of them and read whatever she read in the quality of that exchange and went back to her pasta with the tact of a child who has learned when adults need the room to be slightly less occupied. They went to the side room. The whiteboards were still there, still covered in notes, though someone had started erasing the less relevant sections. The laptops were closed. It looked like a room in the middle of being put away. Scarlett stood by the window. Mason stood near the table. Neither of them sat down, which meant they were both treating this as something that needed to be handled standing up. I run a global operation, Scarlett said. Whitmore Capital has transportation assets on 4 continents. Fleet management, logistics infrastructure, vehicle acquisition, and maintenance. It's a division that has been, to be direct about it, badly managed. The man who ran it was Holt's appointment, and Holt's appointment served Holt's interests, not the company's. She paused. I need someone to run it who understands vehicles, who understands what it means when something doesn't sound right, who has a specific and hard-won relationship with mechanical truth that can't be faked or credentialed or bought. Mason was looking at her steadily. He hadn't moved. The salary is significant, she said. I'll tell you the number, and you can decide what you think of it. Full medical coverage for you and Emma, a housing allowance that is also not nothing, and I want to be clear that this is standard for the role, not something I invented. She held his gaze. And there's an educational trust component for dependents of senior staff. Emma would be covered, through college, whatever she chooses. The room was quiet for a moment. Why me? He said. Because you saw a cut tire at night in the rain and knew what it meant, she said. Because you looked at a grainy security camera frame and found something 2 professional investigators missed. Because when someone offered you cash on the side of a highway, you didn't take it. And because... She stopped, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked slightly uncertain. Not lost, but uncertain. Because I have spent the past 6 months trusting almost no one, and I have been mostly right to do that, and you are one of 2 people in the past year who I have trusted completely and been correct about. Who's the other one? He asked. Chen, she said. And I headhunted her for 4 months before I hired her. He almost smiled at that. I'm not a finance guy, he said. I don't know anything about investment management or logistics software, or I have people for that, she said. I need someone who can look at a vehicle acquisition list and tell me if the numbers don't make sense. Who can walk through a maintenance operation in Singapore or Rotterdam and know in 20 minutes whether the people running it know what they're doing. Who can't be impressed by credentials enough to stop asking the right questions. She looked at him directly. I need mechanical honesty, which is different from every other kind. Mason stood there with that for a moment. He thought about the shop on Clement Street with the missing letter on the sign. He thought about the equipment loan and the overdue rent and the legal pad with the list on it that Emma had drawn on the back of. He thought about Emma's shoes that were half a size too small and the backpack zipper pinned shut with a safety pin and the specific quiet weight of a life that was trying very hard and still coming up short. He thought about Lauren, who had told him once they'd been arguing about money, the early kind of argument that young couples have about money before they figure out how to argue about it properly, that he was the most stubborn person she'd ever met, and that his stubbornness was both his best quality and his worst problem. He'd known she was right then, and he still knew it. I need a few days to wind down the shop properly, he said. I can't just walk out on the clients I have. Scarlett didn't blink. Of course. And I want to fix the car situation for Patricia. She's got a Civic on my lift and she's been patient about it. I want to finish that job before anything else. All right. And I'm driving my own truck, he said, which was not relevant to the conversation they were having, but came out anyway. I would expect nothing less, she said, and this time the almost smile on her face was not almost anything. It was a real one, and it reached her eyes. They stood there in the side room with the erased whiteboards and the closed laptops and the last light of the afternoon coming through the window, and neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing needed to be said right now that hadn't been said. From the kitchen came the sound of Emma finishing her pasta and beginning to tell whoever was in the room with her about the ongoing elephant and mouse debate, her voice earnest and carrying, the voice of a child who had not yet learned to modulate her certainty about things she was certain about. Mason listened to his daughter talk. He thought about Highway 9 in the rain. He thought about a tire he'd crouched beside in the dark with a mag light and a score mark that didn't belong. And 40 minutes on a wet highway with a stranger who had turned out to be something more specific and complicated than a stranger. He thought about how a single decision to pull over had turned into all of this: the federal case, the arrest, the evidence, Emma's card with the yellow truck on it, and he still couldn't decide whether that was the kind of thing you were supposed to find meaning in or just the kind of thing that happened. He decided, standing there, that it didn't much matter which. It had happened. He'd been there. He'd looked at the thing that didn't look right and said so, which was all he'd ever known how to do. "Okay," he said. Scarlett looked at him. "Okay, yes?" "Okay, yes," he said. She nodded once, professional, compact, and then she extended her hand the same way she had in the truck on a rainy highway 3 nights ago, and he shook it the same way he had then, and it was different this time in all the ways that 3 nights of events made things different. But the fundamental transaction of it was the same: 2 people deciding to trust each other. He'd done it once in the rain for no particular reason except that it seemed right. He was doing it again now for a slightly longer list of reasons, but the foundation was the same, and he figured that was probably good enough. He drove back to the apartment on Friday morning, alone this time. No Tahoe behind him, no Rollins in the passenger seat watching the mirrors. Scarlett had offered, and he'd said no, and she hadn't pushed it, which was one of the things he was starting to understand about her. She knew which arguments to make and which ones to let go, and she made that distinction faster than most people he'd known. Emma stayed at the estate for the morning, in the garden with Avery's patient supervision and the fountain she'd come to treat as a personal property. And Mason drove back into the city with the windows down and the radio on a station he didn't particularly like, but didn't change. The apartment looked the same. Of course it did. It had been 3 days and nothing about a building changes in 3 days. The parking lot had the same cracked asphalt. The mailboxes had the same dented one. The hedge along the east wall had not been trimmed. His apartment was on the 2nd floor, and the hallway smelled the way it always smelled, like the combination of several different households cooking and the cleaning product the super used on Thursdays. He unlocked 214 and went inside. The eviction notice was on the counter where he'd left it. He picked it up this time, opened it, read it. The number was what he'd known it would be: arrears plus fees plus the legal processing costs the management company added, which he'd always found audacious, but which was, unfortunately, legal. The deadline was 12 days away. He set it back down and looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the management company. He got a person named Darlene, who sounded like she'd answered this kind of call before and had a script for it. He told her he intended to pay the full arrears amount within the week and asked what the process was for removing the notice from his file. Darlene told him, in measured and not unkind terms, what the process was. He wrote it down. He thanked her. He hung up. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the apartment, really looked at it, the way you look at a place when you're considering what it means and what it's going to mean. 3 years he'd been here. He'd moved in 6 months after Lauren died, when the place they'd shared had become something he couldn't live inside anymore without it costing him things he needed for Emma. This apartment was practical. It was close to the school. Mrs. Patel was next door. It had a 2nd bedroom that Emma had painted one wall of, badly, in a color she'd called sunset, and that was approximately the orange of a traffic cone. He was going to miss that wall, he thought, which was a strange thing to think about a badly painted orange wall, but it was true. He packed more carefully this time than he had on Wednesday, which had been a 12-minute emergency situation. He packed the things that mattered: Emma's drawings from the refrigerator door, the photo of Lauren from the shelf above the TV, the small box of things he kept in the top of the closet that were nobody's business but his. He packed his tools, The personal ones, not the shop equipment, the hand tools that had been his father's first and then became his by the slow accumulation of use. A set of combination wrenches, a timing light from 1987 that still worked perfectly, a small brass-handled screwdriver that had no practical advantage over a modern one, but that his hands knew. He packed these things into the truck bed carefully and covered them with the tarp he kept back there, and then he went back upstairs and stood in Emma's room. The orange wall. He took a picture of it with his phone. Emma would want to know it existed somewhere. She'd want proof of the walls she'd made. He stood there another minute. The room smelled like Emma, like the specific combination of her shampoo and the drawing markers she overused, and Gerald, who had his own particular smell that Mason had stopped being able to identify precisely because it had just become part of the general atmosphere of his daughter. He stood in the room and let it be what it was, and then he went to do the last thing he needed to do before he left. The shop. Patricia's Civic was still on the lift. He'd promised her, and a promise to Patricia counted the same as a promise to anyone else, which was to say it counted fully. He drove to Clement Street and rolled up the bay door and put his jacket on a hook, and spent 2.5 hours finishing the brake job properly. New pads, rotors checked and found acceptable, brake fluid bled, everything torqued to spec, nothing rushed. He drove the Civic around the block twice to bed the pads in. He parked it back in the lot and called Patricia and left a message that her car was ready. Then he stood in the middle of his shop and looked at it. The Ardor Auto sign, the pegboard, the oil stain, Emma's crayon truck on the corner of the shelf, the one labeled Daddy's Truck in uncertain letters. He took that down and folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He thought about the 4 years he'd spent in this space, the cold mornings when the heat took 40 minutes to get the bay to a workable temperature, the summer afternoons that were worse, the clients who became regulars, who became something close to a professional community, Harold and his Subaru, Patricia and the Civic, old Mr. Dominguez with his 1994 pickup that Mason had kept running through the sheer stubbornness of both of them. He thought about what it meant to build something with your own hands and your own name on it and your own reputation holding it up, and what it meant to close it, even temporarily, even with the plan of something larger on the other side. It didn't feel triumphant. He wanted to be honest about that. It felt like leaving, and leaving things you built always has some grief in it, even when you're leaving toward something better, and pretending otherwise is just a way of not respecting what you built. He locked the bay door. He stood outside on the sidewalk and looked at the sign one more time. Then he got in his truck and drove. He called Dex on the way back to the estate. Dex picked up on the first ring, which was unusual. Dex was a man who treated phone calls as optional and texting as preferable and in-person conversation as the only format he actually trusted. "You're alive," Dex said. "I'm alive." "I saw the news," Dex said. "The Whitmore thing. You want to tell me what your dash cam has to do with a federal securities fraud case?" "How'd you know about the dash cam?" "Because the federal investigation's public statement mentioned additional evidence provided by a private citizen, and I know you and your paranoid dash cam setup, and I did math." A pause. "You okay?" "Yeah," Mason said. "I'm okay. I've got something I want to tell you." He told Dex about the job, the offer, what it meant practically, what it meant in terms of the shop, what it meant for Emma. Dex listened without interrupting, which was Dex's real mode. Whatever he said on the phone, in person, or on a call that mattered, he was quiet and still, and he actually listened. When Mason finished, Dex said, "The shop." "Yeah." "You're going to miss it." "Already am." "Good," Dex said. "Means it was real." A pause. "You going to be all right doing something different?" "I don't know yet," Mason said. It was the honest answer. "That's the right answer," Dex said. "You'd worry me if you said yes immediately." Another pause, and Mason could hear him thinking. "Lauren would have told you to take it," he said, "for what it's worth." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "She also would have told me not to wear the same jacket 3 days in a row." Dex made a sound that was almost a laugh. "She would have been right about that too." A beat. "You need anything from me?" "No, I just wanted you to know." "Okay," Dex said simply. "Then I know." They hung up. Mason drove with one hand on the wheel and the window still down and thought about Lauren telling him to take it, which she would have. She'd been the one who pushed him toward the shop in the first place, toward putting his name on something, toward believing that the thing he was good at was worth betting on. He'd resisted then, too. She'd had a phrase for it. She'd called it his productive stubbornness, said it like it was a medical condition, said it like it was also what made him worth knowing. He thought he understood now, more than he had then, what she meant. The estate looked different in the late morning light than it had on Wednesday when he'd arrived under the particular pressure of urgency and displacement. It looked like a place, not a fortress, not a corporate asset, a place where someone lived or was trying to. The coffee mug still on the porch railing, he noticed. Same one. Nobody had moved it. Emma was not at the fountain when he arrived. She was in the kitchen with Avery and what appeared to be a fairly substantial drawing project spread across the table. Large paper, multiple colors, something architectural again. Avery was sitting across from her with the specific expression of a man who has been drafted into an art project he didn't anticipate and is finding it more engaging than expected. Emma looked up when Mason came in, looked at his face, did her assessment. "We're staying for a bit more?" she said. Not quite a question. "We're actually going to move somewhere new," he said. He sat down across from her at the table. "Not here, a different place. But we're going to be okay." She turned this over. "New school?" "Probably, yeah. We'll find you a good one." "Will Priya be there?" "No, bud. Different school." She absorbed this with the solemnity it deserved. Priya was important. The elephant debate was ongoing and required Priya's participation. "Can I call her?" "Of course." "On the tablet?" "Yeah." She went back to her drawing, which apparently resolved the immediate question sufficiently. Then, without looking up, "Is Scarlett going to be around?" Mason looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I think she will be." Emma nodded once with apparent satisfaction and continued drawing. Avery caught Mason's eye briefly across the table with an expression that was carefully neutral and also not quite neutral, and Mason decided he'd met enough of Scarlett's people to know that they were all, in their different ways, paying attention to more than they commented on. Scarlett appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. She'd been on calls all morning. The company's situation required a sustained, layered response that wasn't going to resolve itself in a day or a week, and she'd be managing it in parallel with everything else for months. She looked tired in the functional way of someone who was tired and was going to keep working anyway, which Mason recognized as her default state. She looked at Emma's drawing project. "What is this?" "My new room," Emma said. "I'm planning it." Scarlett looked at Mason. He looked back at her. "She works fast," he said. "Apparently." Scarlett looked at the drawing again, which featured what was either a very large bed or a very ambitious interpretation of a bed, and a shape in the corner that Emma had labeled fountain in approximate spelling. "There's a house," Scarlett said, carefully. "It's a property the company holds, a residential property. It was used by the previous director of the transportation division as a primary residence, and it's been sitting empty for 4 months. It's in a good school district. It has a garden." She paused. "It doesn't have a fountain, but there's a yard. You could put one in." Emma looked up sharply. "A real one?" "A real one," Scarlett said. Emma looked at Mason. He looked at Scarlett. "Is this part of the housing allowance you mentioned?" he asked. "It's within range, yes." He thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to think about Emma's orange wall and Emma's 2 small shoes and the safety pin on the backpack zipper and the eviction notice on the kitchen counter, and then he thought about what Lauren would say, and then he stopped overthinking it. "Okay," he said. Emma went back to her drawing with renewed purpose, adding what appeared to be a fountain to the corner labeled Fountain. The week that followed was the kind of week that exists between one version of a life and another, full of practical tasks that feel simultaneously mundane and significant because they're the physical evidence of a change that's real. Mason paid the arrears on the apartment, the full amount, on Monday. He called Darlene at the management company, and she processed the paperwork, and he received a confirmation email that the notice was resolved, which he read and then deleted because he didn't need it anymore. He called Harold and Patricia and Mr. Dominguez and the others on his regular list and explained, as honestly as he could explain without going into the details that were either confidential or just too long for a phone call, that the shop was closing for now. Harold was more understanding than Mason expected. Patricia said she'd heard something about the Whitmore case on the news, and she was glad he was all right, and her sincerity was so plain and uncomplicated that Mason thanked her twice and meant it both times. Mr. Dominguez was the hardest call. He was 74, and the 94 pickup was a project they'd worked on together over 4 years in the specific way that an ongoing mechanical relationship becomes something else without either party naming it. Mason told him he was closing, and Mr. Dominguez said nothing for a moment and then said, "You're going to do something good." And Mason said he hoped so, and Mr. Dominguez said, "No, I know it, I can tell," which was more than Mason had earned, and also, from a 74-year-old who'd known him 4 years, meant something he didn't entirely know what to do with. He returned the shop keys to Bourdain's agent on Wednesday. The agent, who had been unavailable for 6 months, was suddenly very available and very apologetic about the delays in communication, and Mason signed the termination paperwork and shook the man's hand and walked out to the Ardor Auto sign one last time. He thought about taking it. He decided against it. Whoever came next could figure out the missing letter situation for themselves. The house Scarlett had referenced was in a neighborhood called Ardmore Hills, 40 minutes from the city, with actual trees on the street and a school 3 blocks away that had a rating that made the previous school look like an afterthought. It was not enormous. 4 bedrooms, a decent yard, a kitchen that was larger than anything Mason had ever cooked in. The garden had been neglected for 4 months but had the bones of something good, which was a phrase he caught himself using and then recognized as the mechanical observation part of his brain applying itself to horticulture, which was probably fine. Emma walked through it with Gerald under her arm and a very serious expression, conducting an inspection that she performed with the thoroughness of someone who intended to render a verdict. She went through every room. She tested the light switches. She looked in the closets. She went to the yard and stood in the middle of it and turned around slowly, assessing the space from every angle. "Where's the fountain going?" she asked. "Probably there," Mason said, pointing to the corner near the fence where there was a flat stone section that would make sense structurally. She looked at the spot, evaluated it. "Okay," she said. "I like it." "Yeah?" "It needs paint in my room, though," she said. "The walls are white." "What color?" She thought about this with appropriate gravity. Not orange again, something different. She looked at the walls from the yard through the window. "Maybe yellow." "Yellow's good," he said. "Can I pick?" "You always pick," he said. She seemed satisfied with this. She walked back inside to further inspect the kitchen, which had become relevant to her since Avery had shown her, over several afternoons at the estate, that cooking was a thing with steps and results, and that the steps were, in her assessment, interesting. Mason stood in the yard in the October light and looked at the space where the fountain would go and thought about water running over stone, and about a 6-year-old standing at a fountain's edge, putting her hands in the falling water and saying it was cold and being surprised by that, and he thought that surprise at cold water was maybe one of the better things a person could feel on any given day. The uncomplicated surprise of something being itself. His first week at Whitmore Capital was not what he expected, which was what he'd expected. He'd expected to feel out of place, and he did. The offices were on the 38th floor of a building where the elevators were quiet, and the carpet was thick, and everyone moved with the efficiency of people who'd been doing exactly this for years. He wore what he had, which was clean and decent, but not corporate, and he decided before he walked in on Monday morning that if that was a problem, he'd hear about it and deal with it then, and nobody said a word about it. And he later found out from Chen that Scarlett had sent a note to the relevant people explaining that the new transportation director had specific and useful reasons for not looking like a transportation director, and that they were to treat him accordingly. He found out also, later, that 2 of the senior analysts had run a background search on him in the first week, which was apparently standard for significant hires, and that their findings had circulated in a way that was not entirely professional, but was very human. What the footage showed, what he'd identified, what it had led to. He started getting treated differently after that, which he didn't entirely like but understood. People needed a framework for new information, and his framework was the mechanic who broke the case, which was reductive but not entirely wrong. The work itself was more interesting than he'd braced for. The Transportation Division managed a fleet of nearly 300 vehicles across 12 countries. Everything from executive cars to heavy logistics equipment to specialty vehicles used in property management and infrastructure. The division had been, under its previous director, running at a loss that the fraudulent accounting had partially concealed, and the degree to which basic mechanical logic had been ignored in fleet management and acquisition decisions was something that Mason found simultaneously appalling and clarifying. He understood this. He understood inefficiency in mechanical systems. He understood what it looked like when someone was making decisions based on what looked good on paper rather than what actually worked, and he knew how to identify the difference. He spent his first 2 weeks reading every maintenance log, every acquisition record, every fleet report he could find. He took notes on his legal pad because he'd tried the digital note-taking system the company used and found it added a layer between him and his own thinking that he didn't need. Chen came to find him on his 7th day and said, "You're going to have a lot of opinions about the Singapore operation." And he said, "I already do." And she said, "Good. Write them down and we'll go through them." Which was the beginning of a working relationship that was, in its precision and absence of unnecessary talk, one of the most functional he'd ever had. He called Vasquez on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the arrest to ask about the timeline on the federal proceedings. She told him the case was solid, that Frick had entered a plea agreement that had substantially strengthened the evidentiary foundation, that Holt's legal team was making noise, but making it in the way legal teams made noise when they knew the noise wasn't going to change the outcome. Price and Cunningham had cooperated fully and would receive reduced sentences. The frozen assets were in the process of being returned to Whitmore Capital through a recovery mechanism that the company's legal team and the federal prosecutors had worked out, which was going to take time, but was going to happen. "The dash cam footage," Vasquez said before she hung up. "It's going to be referenced in the federal record as critical evidence. I want you to know that." "Okay," he said. "A $47 dash cam," she said, and he could hear something in her voice that was between professional and personal. $300 suits couldn't touch what that footage did. "Suits don't fix anything," Mason said. "They just cover it up." A pause. Then she said, "I'm going to think about that for a while," and hung up. Emma started at her new school on a Monday in October, 3 weeks after they moved into the Ardmore Hills house. Mason drove her himself, not in the company car that Whitmore Capital had offered as a standard perk, but in his own truck, which was parked in the new house's driveway and which he intended to keep driving for the foreseeable future and probably longer than that. Emma wore a backpack that was new and had a working zipper and that she had chosen herself, and she was wearing shoes that fit. The shoes were a detail that probably wouldn't mean anything to anyone who hadn't been watching the shoes get smaller for 8 months, while the money to replace them kept getting redirected to more urgent things. To Mason, it meant something he didn't have a word for. It was in the same category as Emma sleeping in a room she'd helped paint, yellow, a warm one, that she'd been very specific about at the paint store, and having a yard to run in and a school where, within 2 weeks, she'd located a girl named Simone who was, according to Emma, wrong about dolphins but right about everything else, which was apparently sufficient foundation for a solid friendship. He stood at the drop-off lane on her first day and watched her go in through the doors with her new backpack and her new shoes, and Gerald tucked inside the top pocket, just visible. And he stood there for a moment after the door closed the same way he always stood there, and the standing there felt different, not because he was in a different parking lot or because Emma was in better shoes, because the weight he'd been carrying for 3 years, the specific weight of not being enough, of trying hard and still coming up short, of loving your kid completely and still being afraid that love alone wasn't going to cover what she needed, that weight was different now, not gone, redistributed, lighter. He got back in his truck. He sat there for a second with his hands on the wheel. He thought about Highway 9 in the rain. He thought about how close he'd come to not stopping, about the 4 seconds he'd sat with his foot on the brake and the wipers going, and the legitimate, practical, reasonable thought that it wasn't his problem, and he needed to get home, and he was already tired, and there were cars on that road all the time. 4 seconds is a short time for a decision that turns out to matter. He'd made the same kind of 4-second decisions 100 times in his life. to stop and help, or to keep going. Most of them had been forgotten inside of a week. This one had not. He didn't think that made him special. That was important to him, not thinking it made him special. He'd stopped because it was right to stop. Because you saw a person who needed help and you could help, and you did. That was the whole of it. The fact that it had unraveled into something enormous was not because of who he was. It was because of what he'd noticed. And what he'd noticed was a professional skill, not a character distinction. Any competent mechanic looking at that tire with a flashlight would have seen the same thing, except that most people wouldn't have stopped to look. That was the part he kept coming back to. Not what he'd seen, but the stopping. The willingness to get out of a warm truck in a bad storm and crouch in the rain and look at something that wasn't his problem with the full attention it deserved. He didn't know why he was built that way. He didn't know why some people stopped and some people didn't, and he wasn't sure the question had a clean answer. But he thought it had something to do with the belief that things mattered, that the car on the side of the road mattered, that the cut in the tire mattered, that getting it right mattered even when nobody was watching and nobody would know and there was no reward for it. He'd been running on that belief his whole life. In the shop, where you could fake a repair or do it right, and the difference was something only you and the car would ever know. In the year after Lauren died, where the easy path would have been to let things slide, to let Emma's routine slip, to stop making the school lunches and the bedtime routines and the small, careful structures that a grieving man builds for a 3-year-old because the 3-year-old needs them even when the man doesn't have anything left. He'd done it anyway. Not because he was exceptional, because it mattered, and he knew it mattered, and he couldn't unknow that. That was all it ever was. He just couldn't unknow things that mattered. He started the truck and pulled out of the drop-off lane and drove toward the highway. A month after Emma started school, Scarlett drove out to Ardmore Hills on a Saturday afternoon. She called first, which he noticed. She didn't assume access to his time, which he'd learned was not her default mode in professional contexts, but which she applied to his specifically. He said yes, and she drove out. And she arrived in the kind of car she was driving now instead of the Mercedes, a sensible black sedan that she'd chosen after the Mercedes situation, as she referred to it without elaboration. He made coffee. Real coffee. Not the estate's complicated machine, but the basic drip setup he'd had since before Emma was born, and that made coffee he knew how to adjust. She sat at the kitchen table, and Emma immediately appeared from wherever she'd been and placed Gerald on the table in front of Scarlett as a formal introduction, which Gerald had apparently been deemed ready for. "He's met you before," Scarlett said. "Not officially," Emma said, with the certainty of a child who has a clear internal record of what counts. "Fair enough," Scarlett said. She looked at Gerald with appropriate seriousness. "Hello, Gerald." Emma appeared satisfied and went back to what she'd been doing, which was a drawing of the yard that included both the actual fountain, now installed, and several features of the yard that did not yet exist but that Emma was apparently planning to lobby for. Scarlett wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the kitchen, at the crayon drawings on the refrigerator door, at the row of Emma's shoes by the door, 3 pairs, all of them fitting, at the yellow light coming through the window from the yard. "How are you?" she asked. Not the professional version, the other version. "Good," Mason said, and then, because she'd been honest with him repeatedly, and he owed her the same, "Better than good, I think." She nodded. "The Singapore team," she said. "Your notes on the maintenance schedule." "I was going to bring that up Monday." "I know. I'm bringing it up now." She looked at him across the table. "You were right about all of it. Every flag you identified in the logs corresponds to an actual maintenance failure that the previous director had been papering over. We're restructuring the entire operation based on your analysis." "I wasn't trying to restructure anything," he said. "I was just reading the logs." "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." He drank his coffee. Outside, through the window, the fountain ran. The new one, stone and simple, set in the corner of the yard where he'd said it would go, running on a low pump that kept the basin full and the sound consistent. Emma had stood at it for 40 minutes the day they turned it on, conducting the same experiments with the falling water that she'd conducted at the estate, checking whether the water here was also cold, determining that it was, and receiving this information with the same pleased surprise she'd shown the first time. Cold water being cold, reliable. Good. Mason, Scarlett said. He looked at her. I want to ask you something that isn't about work, she said. He waited. Are you? She stopped. Tried again. This is awkward for me to say. Then say it fast, he said. That's usually the way. She looked at him. Something in her face was less composed than her professional default, which he'd come to recognize as the version of her that was real. Are you all right? Not the job. Not Emma. You. She set down her coffee cup. Because you've been through a lot in the last few years, and you do the thing where you... She paused, looking for the word. You point the flashlight at everything else. He was quiet for a moment. It was a precise observation which didn't surprise him. It surprised him that she'd said it out loud. I'm all right, he said. And then, because that was too easy and she deserved better. I'm getting there, which is different, but it's the right direction. She held his gaze for a second, not pushing it, not making it into something it wasn't yet. Just receiving it, the way she'd received things during those 3 days at the estate, with full attention and without demanding more than was being offered. Good, she said simply. They sat with their coffee in the Saturday morning quiet. Emma's voice drifted in from the next room, narrating something to Gerald about the drawing. The fountain ran in the yard. The yellow walls of the kitchen held the light the way Emma had known they would when she'd stood in the paint store pointing at the sample card with absolute conviction. It was not a perfect situation. Mason's professional learning curve was real and sometimes uncomfortable, and there were days at the office where he felt the distance between what he knew and what the room expected him to know, like a physical thing. Emma was still working through the loss of Priya at her old school, and some nights she cried about it in the specific helpless way that kids cry about things they can't control. And Mason sat with her and didn't try to fix it because it didn't need fixing, it needed company. The Holt proceedings were ongoing and would be for another year at least, and Vasquez called periodically with updates that were almost always good, and still managed to pull Mason briefly back into the particular atmosphere of that highway, that rain, that tire. He carried Lauren the way you carry someone you've loved and lost, not as a wound, not by the second year, but as a presence, a familiar weight that had become part of how he stood. He talked to her sometimes, in his head, not believing she heard it, just thinking out loud in her direction. He talked to her about Emma's yellow room and Emma's new school and Emma's fountain. He talked to her about the Singapore maintenance logs, which would have bored Lauren completely, and which he would have explained to her anyway, and she would have listened to anyway, because that was who she was. He talked to her about Scarlett, which was more complicated territory that he was not ready to examine closely, and didn't try to. There were things ahead that he couldn't see. That was just true. He'd learned 3 years ago, the worst way, that you couldn't see what was coming. The lesson from that wasn't to stop going forward. The lesson was to pay attention to what was right in front of you. The thing that didn't look right, the mark on the tire, the child at the fountain, the person across the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee cup, and give it the full attention it deserved. He'd built his whole professional life on that, on looking at the thing in front of him without flinching from what it actually was, on not making the cut in the sidewall into a blowout because a blowout was easier to accept, on following the evidence to where it actually went rather than where it was more convenient to stop. He thought that was probably how you lived a life too, not by knowing what was coming, by being honest about what was already there. Scarlett finished her coffee. She looked out at the yard through the kitchen window for a moment, at the fountain, at the late October garden with its imperfect lawn and its good bones, at the sky above it, which was the specific clear blue that came after weeks of rain. It's a good yard, she said. It is, he said. Emma picked the fountain location? I picked it. She approved it. That sounds right, she said, and there was something quiet in her voice that matched the day, matched the light, matched the sound of the fountain doing its simple and reliable work in the corner of the yard. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway with her drawing and Gerald. She looked at Scarlett, then at her father, then at the window. The fountain's on, she said. It's always on, Mason said. I know, she said. I like it. She went to the window and looked out at it for a moment, the way she'd looked at the first one. That same quality of attention, the same willingness to just look at something and let it be what it was. Then she turned around. "Can we have lunch soon? I'm hungry." "Yeah," Mason said. "We can have lunch." Emma went back to wherever she'd been. Mason started getting things from the refrigerator. Scarlett stood up and offered to help without making a production of it, and he handed her things to put on the table without making a production of that either. Outside, the fountain ran and the light moved across the yard the way light moves when no one is watching it particularly, just doing what it does, consistent and without fanfare. There are moments that you recognize, even as they're happening, as the ones you're going to carry. Not because they're dramatic, not because something is at stake, because they're real and warm and specific and belong completely to the people inside them. This was one of those. A mechanic, a billionaire, and a 6-year-old with a one-eyed elephant making lunch on a Saturday in October in a house with yellow walls and a fountain in the yard, in the ordinary aftermath of an extraordinary thing, which is the only place any extraordinary thing ever actually ends up. Right here. Lunch, the fountain running, the day continuing. That's enough. It turns out that was always enough.